gun pointed straight at his head. In a diner, broad daylight. No one screamed. No one moved. Just spoons clinking against coffee cups in dead silence. Because scenes like this, too familiar. Because sometimes skin color is all it takes to be guilty. One bullet can take a life, but can it stop a nation long enough to ask, why is this still happening? If you were there, would you look away or stand up? Could this happen where you live? Under the midday sunlight filtering through the striped curtains of the vintage diner on the corner of Main and Jefferson, everything seemed to move to the slow rhythm of a town long accustomed to silence. Inside, the scent of toasted bread blended with the rich aroma of dark coffee, and the soft clinking of spoons against glass cups was the only sound breaking into the murmured conversations of old folks reminiscing about the days when prices still made sense. On the southern wall, an old clock with an offbeat second hand ticked gently, as if reminding someone that here time was never in a hurry. Table 3 by the window, that seat was almost always kept open, no reservations needed. An elderly black man sat there every Thursday precisely at 11:40. No one knew his name. To the waitress, he was Sir. To the diner owner, he was the man who reads. To the neighboring patrons, he was simply a familiar part of the midday picture, like the chipped wooden chair or the ceiling fan that clicked with every spin. He wore a crisply ironed white shirt, layered under an old brown vest that still held its neatly folded cuffs. His face was a portrait of many decades. A high forehead, cheek sunken with time, and deep eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much to still be surprised. On the table lay a dark brown leather-bound book, its spine slightly cracked with a few small pages tucked inside, marked with carefully folded corners. In his left hand, he held a cup of black tea. His right hand turned the pages with a motion so slow it felt meditative, as if each sentence required space, not only to be read, but to be understood across years. This was how he always appeared, unbothered, alone, and quietly present, until the day a uniformed man burst in and pointed a gun straight at his head. No one asked what he did for a living. No one tried too hard to make small talk. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, quiet, unassuming, that made people feel a kind of respect they couldn't quite name. He didn't need to do anything at all. Just by sitting there, the entire room seemed to soften. To some younger folks he was unusual, but to the older ones that calm presence was something once familiar, before the world began to rush. A short screech of brakes pierced the air just outside the diner, prompting a few customers mid-sip to glance toward the door. A white and blue patrol car had pulled onto the curb at an angle, jutting out of the parking lines like the driver didn't care much for order. The car door swung open with a snap. 2 police officers stepped out, their uniforms pressed, shoes gleaming, and eyes sweeping the scene as if they were scanning a battlefield, not a weathered family diner. The front man was tall, with a tight buzz cut and a face carved with suspicion. The nameplate on his chest read Vans. His eyes moved from steaming plates of sunny-side-up eggs to wrinkled hands holding coffee mugs, then stopped at table 3 by the window. The old black man sat there, still holding his book, entirely undisturbed by the arrival of 2 men who carried tension like a weapon. The second officer was much younger, looking not yet 30. His face still held traces of hesitation, the kind that hadn't yet hardened enough to stand squarely beside the gun at his hip. He walked half a step behind Vance, his eyes darting across the room, pausing briefly on an elderly woman placing pastries onto a plate before quickly dropping to the floor. The difference in age and bearing between them seemed to cast him in the shadow of the man who led. In that moment, no one spoke. The air in the diner, already thick with coffee and memory, now held something sharper, like the edge of a decision not yet made. Vance entered without greeting anyone. His voice rang out like a command, devoid of any question mark. Someone reported a suspicious individual. Sitting alone, appears to be writing something down in a notebook. The words dropped into the diner like a stone into a still pond. Spoons froze mid-air, halted just before reaching mouths. The young waitress behind the counter looked up, still holding the coffee pot, her eyes shifting from Vance to the old man. In that moment, no one said a word. No one dared. The old man slowly lifted his head. His eyes were deep, calm, like a dark lake reflecting the harsh sun of a summer day. He gently placed the book down on the table, one finger still wedged between the pages to mark his place. His voice was soft but clear, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "Since when did writing become a suspicious act, officer?" Vance narrowed his eyes. There was something in that question that made him pause for a second, just one, before switching to a more forceful tone. "The question is, what are you writing? For whom? And what's your purpose?" The silence in the room thickened, like the heat before a storm, holding its breath while eyes flicked between the man with the book and the man with the badge. No one reached for their coffee. No one moved. Time, like the second hand on the wall clock, seemed to stutter and wait. The old man didn't answer right away. He lifted his teacup, took a sip, then set it down with a movement that was precise, unhurried. "If I'm writing about my lunch," he said, "do I need to report that to the police?" A cold draft cut through the thick atmosphere in the diner. Vance stepped forward, now blocking the view of customers who had been trying to watch from a distance, his hand lowered, resting at his belt, close to the gun. His voice no longer carried implication, it was a warning. "I won't repeat myself. Hand me your notebook." The young waitress blurted out, "Officer, Quiet," Vance snapped, turning his head. "This is official procedure." The girl, barely in her 20s, lowered her gaze, her hands beginning to tremble. She backed toward the counter, bumping lightly into the utensil rack. Metal spoons clattered onto the floor, the cold, dry clang sounding like the mechanical click of a trigger being pulled. An elderly woman seated at the table near the window, the one who had known the old man for decades, slowly stood. She steadied herself against the back of the chair, her voice frail but firm. "He eats lunch here every Thursday. For more than 10 years. Vance didn't turn around. His hand stayed at his belt, his eyes fixed on the old man, who still hadn't stood, still showed no sign of unease. Only one thing had changed. The leather-bound book was now closed, his hand resting atop it on the table, not in surrender, but as if bracing for what was about to come. No one spoke again, not out of fear, but because something heavier than fear had swept through the room, the creeping sense that something deeply wrong was happening, and they had seen it before, in memories, on screens, in history, but never this close. The air inside the diner grew thick, as if someone had just sealed shut every invisible door. The clink of spoon against teacup, the sound of pages turning, even the breathing, all of it vanished. Every eye was fixed on table 3, where an elderly man sat, his hand resting on the closed book, his gaze calm but no longer untouched. A faint crease had formed on his forehead, not out of fear, but as if he were calculating just how far this ugliness might go. The officer named Vance stood upright, his hand still at his belt, thumb curled inward as though weighing something unspoken. The old man hadn't moved, still seated, still looking straight ahead, no flinching, no provocation, still holding on to the same silence he always had, though today, strangely, it had become the reason to be threatened. Vance clenched his jaw. A short pause. Then, without warning, he drew his gun. The movement was so sudden that several people in the diner jerked backward, chairs tipping, glasses spilling. The young waitress let out a reflexive scream that caught in her throat. The elderly woman nearby raised her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. The younger officer, Ethan, took a step back, then froze, as if he had just seen something that went far beyond anything the Academy had ever prepared him for. "Stand up!" Vance barked, his gun aimed squarely at the old man's chest. "Now!" The old man didn't respond immediately. He looked at the barrel of the gun, then at the man holding it, as if trying to find something in his eyes, a trace of conscience, a reason, or, at the very least, a flicker of doubt. But there was nothing, only the hollow gaze of someone too accustomed to power to remember they were facing a human being. He placed his hand on the table, very slowly, in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. His voice remained soft, but this time it carried no irony. "I will stand. But after today, it is you who will have to answer." No one in the diner dared to guess what would happen next, but they all knew one thing for certain. A line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The silence inside the diner didn't fade. It remained frozen between the moment the gun was drawn and the dry command uttered by the man in uniform. Those present that day, if ever asked later, wouldn't speak of the sound. They would speak of the feeling, as if the entire room had been pulled back into a time they thought was long gone, a time when a wrong glance, a gesture that didn't please, could be enough for someone to disappear. The young waitress still stood behind the counter, gripping its edge, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She said nothing. She looked at the old man, then at the gun, then toward the young officer who had come in with the older one, as if hoping someone might intervene. But the young man, Ethan, remained frozen. His face had gone pale, eyes downcast, as if trying to avoid the truth he wasn't yet ready to confront. A middle-aged man at a nearby table slid his hand into his jacket pocket, quietly pulling out a phone. No one said a word. No one stopped him. And no one offered help. He raised the device and began recording what unfolded in front of him, but never uttered a single word. No, what's going on? No, don't do this. Just the quiet press of a record button, like a desperate attempt to cling to proof, something to tell himself later. I did something, even if that something was standing aside. No one asked further, because everyone understood that some wounds had lain dormant for too long beneath the soil of artificial civility. They needed only the thinnest excuse to resurface, and that day, Officer Vance's gun was the excuse. While every eye remained frozen on the barrel of the gun, the old man began to move, not hurried, not agitated. He removed the napkin from his lap, folded it neatly, and then placed it on the table. In another context, the gesture might have simply marked the end of a meal, but here it felt like a ritual, closing something far greater. He stood. His body rose from the chair in one steady motion, slow but unwavering. His gaze swept across the weapon aimed at him, then shifted to the face of the man holding it. He didn't frown, didn't crease his brow, nor did he show any trace of fear. What was visible instead was a clear disappointment, as if he had just come to terms with the fact that the man before him wasn't dangerous because he held a gun, but because he held power without understanding what that power was meant for. His voice rang out, low, deep, but strikingly clear in the stillness of the room, so quiet one could hear a heartbeat. Surely you were trained better than this. The words weren't just for Vance. They echoed as a message to the entire system that had produced someone capable of pointing a gun at an elderly man having lunch simply because he sat alone and took notes. And in that very brief moment, a few people in the diner felt as though they had just been questioned, not with words, but through the presence of a man who was tired of having to remind others that he, too, was human. Ethan stood motionless, his hand curled slightly at his side, as if he wanted to act but didn't know where to begin. Before him was a scene no training manual had ever addressed directly. An old man with a gun pointed at his chest, who still held his gaze calmly. And not one person in the room, including Ethan, dared to say aloud that it was wrong. He swallowed hard. Sweat began to bead along his spine, slipping beneath the layers of his bulletproof vest. His eyes shifted toward the old man. That man wasn't trembling, wasn't resisting, wasn't reacting in any of the ways the Academy scenarios had ever prepared him for. No threats, no sudden gestures, no clenched fists behind the back or any signs of concealed danger. He simply stood there, composed, as if what was happening was just a weary repetition. So familiar he no longer bothered to respond with urgency. Ethan looked over at Vance. The older man, more seasoned and with the authority to command him, gripped the gun as if the slightest word of defiance would pull the trigger. The veins in Vance's neck were bulging, his teeth clenched with a rage whose source remained unclear. Was it anger at being questioned, or fury over not receiving blind obedience? In Ethan's mind, a question echoed. What am I witnessing? He wanted to ask Vance, what did he do wrong? But his lips wouldn't part, because he knew even one question could become a black mark across the career he had only just begun. The old man's eyes glanced at him again, not with blame, not seeking help, just a brief look, enough for Ethan to realize this man knew exactly what he was thinking. And yet, he didn't push him, and somehow, that absence of pressure made it harder to breathe. The loyalty Ethan had carried with pride on the day of his oath was being torn in two. On one side stood the system that had trained him, taught him obedience. On the other stood a human being, now in danger before his very eyes, for no reason other than not fitting the preferences of his superior. "Don't be fooled by appearances," Vance's voice roared, a thunderous punch breaking through the already tense air. Ethan flinched. That sentence felt ripped from some outdated handbook, from a time when suspicion alone could justify anything in the name of prevention. He knew Vance was speaking to him and to the whole diner, as if reminding everyone that the old man, calm, seemingly harmless, was still a threat, that his appearance was just a trap. Ethan looked at Vance, then back at the old man. The ache in his chest made him feel as if he were standing between two cliffs, and what scared him most wasn't the barrel of the gun, it was not knowing which side he was on anymore. The old man didn't move much. When he stood, he turned just enough to face the officer pointing the gun at him. But if anyone had been paying close attention, they might have noticed something strange. His left shoulder shifted slightly back, so subtly it would go unnoticed unless seen from the right angle. To an ordinary person, it could have been a simple reflex, perhaps a way to maintain balance or ease a strained muscle. But to someone who had lived a lifetime in the world of law, it was a calculation. In the upper corner of the ceiling, behind the checkout counter, sat an old security camera, its plastic casing dusty, its lens tilted slightly downward. On most days, it captured nothing important. Usually just footage of customers entering, staff wiping tables, and the occasional argument over a bill. But today it captured something else. The image of a man standing still, gaze unbowed, a gun less than 2 steps from his chest, and the entire incident framed clearly, unobstructed. No one in the diner noticed he had turned toward it, not even the man recording with his phone. They were too focused on the gun, on the hand tightening around the trigger, on the look in Vance's eyes, burning not only with anger, but something deeper, darker. Perhaps the sting of wounded pride when power wasn't obeyed without question. The old man spoke again, voice as low as before, this time slightly softer, as if he were speaking to himself, yet still loud enough for the microphone in the corner of the room to catch. "Do you ever think about what comes after the shot?" No one answered, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't dare. Vance remained motionless, as if the question didn't deserve a response, and Ethan, the younger man behind him, had almost forgotten how to breathe. No one in the diner at that moment understood what the old man was doing. They only thought he was too calm, too strange. Some began to wonder, maybe there was something off about him, maybe he was someone dangerous. His composure in a situation where anyone else would have crumbled under fear became the very thing that unsettled people, because this society isn't used to the threat refusing to look powerless. It disrupted the hierarchy they had grown comfortable living within. Later, once everything had come to light, once news programs began replaying that moment over and over from the overhead security camera's angle, people began to understand. They rewound, zoomed in on each frame, and discovered he had positioned himself exactly where the system could record the entire scene. Not just his face, but the gun, the distance between them, the expression on the officer's face as he held the weapon. No one told him to do that. No one else would have even thought of it in the moment. But he was different. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to stomp or protest. He didn't have to prove he was right by arguing or resisting. All he needed was to let the truth exist in a place where no one could erase it. And because of that, the footage would become undeniable. No narration needed, no edits required. It only needed to be seen at the right moment from the right angle, in the right light. A silent message, sent through the simple act of turning his shoulder. The air in the diner seemed to ease slightly after the old man stood up, but that was only an illusion. The tension hadn't dissipated, it had simply settled, simmering like odorless smoke rising from a fire that everyone assumed was out. Everyone knew, even the waitress holding her breath behind the counter, that the worst hadn't happened yet. It was only waiting for an excuse. Vance tightened his grip on the gun in his right hand, his left hand hanging loose but tense, as if ready to lunge at any moment. He stepped back half a pace, then spoke with a voice trying to remain steady, but each word landed heavy, charged with threat. The old man across from him stood with his spine straight. No bowing of the head, no shrugging of the shoulders, no expression beyond a cold calm. He answered as if rebutting an argument in an academic debate, entirely unfazed by the barrel still suspended in the air. "You have no right to ask, unless there's just cause." Vance seemed momentarily thrown by the response, but only for the briefest second. He didn't need time to think. His heel pivoted and his body lunged forward in a motion that was rough, instinctive. No order, no warning, just a charge born of the same reflex he'd used countless times before when he wanted to silence someone. Everyone in the diner gasped. Ethan froze, nearly stepping forward but stopping himself for reasons even he couldn't explain. The person recording trembled. The video would later shake slightly at that very moment. The elderly woman in the knit hat gasped for breath, but then, just as Vance's arm nearly touched the old man's, he spoke. "I am not resisting." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't rushed, but it landed like a hand pulling the brake on a train barreling downhill. Vance halted, his eyes narrowed, not out of threat, but from the unfamiliar sensation of facing someone who showed neither fear nor reaction. Compliance usually came with averted eyes, with recoiling bodies or raised hands. But here, the old man stood upright, spoke clearly, and let everyone hear him. "I am not resisting," he repeated, this time looking Vance dead in the eye without blinking. "But you will regret this." The words carried no threat. They weren't the kind meant to instill fear. They were a prediction, spoken like a truth already settled, waiting only for the moment to arrive, and it made Vance freeze. Not because the old man was terrifying, but because, for a brief instant, Vance himself sensed he no longer had control over what was unfolding. In the man's eyes, Vance didn't see defiance, no submission. He saw something far more dangerous. Understanding. And Vance knew when the person facing the gun is no longer afraid, the gun loses its power. The chaos wasn't loud like in the movies. There were no collective screams, no one banging tables or rising in protest. Everything played out at a volume so low it felt chilling, but every glance, every breath was taut as a drawn wire. The young man sitting near the exit, still secretly recording on his phone, glanced around once, then quickly swiped up on the screen. The app's interface appeared. He tapped Upload Now, without edits, without any elaborate caption, just one line: "Cop points gun at innocent old man." Within seconds, the video was live on social media. The first shares began to ripple, and inside the diner, the truth continued to unfold like a portrait finally revealing its final strokes. The old man remained still, his expression unchanged. Vance tightened his grip on the gun. The distance between them was so short that a single unexpected movement could send everything spinning out of control. But the old man didn't back away, nor did he step forward. He simply raised his hand and slowly reached into the breast pocket of his vest. Ethan let out a soft sound, barely a whisper. He meant to say something, but his throat locked up, parched and frozen. A second dragged on. Vance saw the old man's hand draw out a small metallic object, and in that instant, his world snapped into pure reflex. Drop it, put it down now," Vance shouted, his voice tearing through the compressed silence like a blade. The barrel of the gun pushed forward, ready to fire. His eyes flared, not just with alertness, but panic. In that moment, He didn't see an old man. He saw a threat, not because of the action, but because the man didn't obey the way he wanted him to. But the old man's hand did not tremble. He didn't lower it in haste, nor did he throw the object as if fearing a bullet. He extended it in front of him, then gently bowed and set it on the table. There was no loud sound, no movement that resembled drawing a weapon, just an aged hand opening to reveal a small rectangular metal item, heavier than a business card, thinner than a wallet. The object caught the yellow diner light. One side gleamed, bordered in silver trim, embossed with an official seal. Anyone sitting nearby could read the engraved line in formal typeface. United States Supreme Court, official identification. Vance froze. His hand still gripped the gun, but his trigger finger had lost its tension. His eyes scanned the words again, as if refusing to believe what they said. Ethan exhaled sharply and took a step back. The entire diner fell into a different kind of silence. Not fear, but shock. Because that badge was not just proof of who the old man was. It was an unspoken indictment against anyone who believed power gave them the right to disregard a human being's dignity because of their skin color, their age, or their silence. Vance looked at the badge, then at the old man, then back at the badge. He didn't lower the gun immediately, but everyone in that diner knew. In that instant, the control he believed he had was gone. And what terrified him most wasn't the badge itself. It was the realization that he had never asked himself, without it, did that old man deserve to be treated any differently? No one in the diner moved. Even the act of breathing seemed cautious, as if a single sound might shatter this fragile reality. The badge still lay on the table, catching streaks of silver under the diner's warm yellow lights, resting squarely between the old man's hands. No one remembered what they had been eating, drinking, or planning to do after lunch. Every thought now centered on the embossed words etched into the thin metal. United States Supreme Court. Official identification. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide. He had studied the federal judiciary in his criminal law class. He knew what that badge meant. The eagle emblem, the engraved lettering, and the laser-etched border are impossible to counterfeit. It wasn't just an ID, it was a declaration of authority at the highest level of United States law. And now it sat motionless on a worn wooden table in a modest diner at noon, pulled from the chest pocket of a man who, just moments ago, they thought might be a suspect. Ethan's face went pale. His arms dropped to his sides. He turned toward Vance, as if hoping for an explanation, a command, or at least a signal that someone understood what was happening. But Vance stood frozen, like a statue. His eyes locked on the inscription, then on the old man. Again, then again. His mouth parted slightly, as though words were forming, but none came. He stammered, visibly trying to choke back the shock, unable to conceal it. What is this? Who are you? No one answered. No one needed to. The answer was already there. Visible, undeniable. The issue was no longer who the old man was, it was how they had treated him before knowing who he was. The old man remained upright, his eyes devoid of retaliation or mockery. In his gaze was only one thing, a deep, drawn-out silence, as if he had grown used to witnessing this scene repeat itself. And always, only after his identity was revealed did people begin to treat him like a human being. No one spoke again. In a place once filled with the clatter of cutlery, only a heavy silence remained. A silence that forced everyone to look inward. Not because he was a high-ranking official or had once served in the nation's highest court, but because, without that badge, he might have ended up on the floor, simply for having claimed the right to be silent, as an old black man not deemed legally believable. Ethan lowered his head, stepped back half a pace, and, in his eyes, for the first time since joining the force, there was a shame no one needed to speak aloud. The badge remained on the table, perfectly flat like a statement that needed no voice. The light above caught its silver edges, making it seem to glow in the silence that had swallowed the room. Vance still stood frozen. Ethan had stepped back 2 paces, his eyes fixed on the old man, not with tension anymore, but with astonishment tinged by something almost like shame. The old man never touched the badge. He didn't explain. He didn't need to speak of his position, didn't cite any legal clause, didn't recite the titles he had once held. His name had not been spoken. But in that room, everyone already understood that the man before them was not an ordinary citizen, and certainly not a suspicious individual. They stood before something greater, not because of a title, but because he stood so still that it made the entire structure of authority hesitate. Vance swallowed hard. His throat was dry, the arrogance usually settled in his face now stripped away. Under the old man's gaze, the self-assurance that came so naturally to a police officer turned awkward, exposed. Vance had commanded hundreds, had cleared public spaces with nothing more than a look or a tone of voice. But now, he seemed undone by nothing more than a man's gaze, as if being forced to see himself in a mirror he never meant to face. "You want to know my name," the old man said, his voice low but clear. "Yet you haven't asked the more important question." Vance frowned, as if he didn't understand. The old man lifted his head, his eyes not angry, but so heavy they seemed to shrink the room. He continued, his words soft as breath, yet weighted like a verdict. "If you don't know who I am, then you shouldn't do that to anyone." The words fell slowly, not sharp like a stab, but with the quiet echo of a truth so simple it made people bow their heads. In that moment, the diners seemed to awaken from a collective trance. The witnesses, the young waitress, the man holding the phone, the elderly woman sitting in the corner, began to realize that their silence, too, had been part of the mistake. They had let it happen, right in front of them, and done nothing just because they thought the old man didn't look like anyone important, just because he sat alone, just because he didn't respond the right way. A customer quietly set down their spoon, not because the food had gone cold, but because their hand was trembling. Another lowered their head, avoiding the old man's gaze, as if afraid to meet the eyes of their conscience. No one had been accused, yet each person felt they had just been named. No slogans were shouted, no stage was needed, just a single sentence, and the entire room changed. The old man leaned down, gently picking up the napkin that had rested on the table, not to leave, but to mark the end of a silence he had held for far too long. And in that moment, for the first time since the officer walked in, he allowed himself to exhale, not from fear, but because he knew a part of the veil had been lifted, and this time they would have to look. Ethan took another step back, then turned and walked quickly out the door without saying a word. The glass door opened and shut behind him, leaving behind a silence so dense it felt like someone had pulled the spine out of the room. He didn't shout, didn't draw his gun, didn't issue any command, but the way he left, hurried, alone, revealed that something inside him had just cracked. Outside, his hand shook slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket, not to call for backup, not to dial dispatch. He tapped the number of someone in the command tier, someone with clearance to run a rapid background check. "What's the name?" the voice on the other end asked, urgent. Ethan looked back toward the diner, where the man still stood motionless beside the badge. He didn't answer right away. It took him a moment to find the words. Then, quietly, he said, "Supreme Court." Just 1 minute later, the police intranet lit up with a string of alerts, a priority identity verification request. The command unit rerouted the query to the federal level, then to the Department of Homeland Security. Within 10 minutes, the name of the old man, the one no one in the diner had called by name, surfaces in a database no one expected to be accessed that day. Inside the diner, movement gradually resumed, not because fear had vanished, but because the shock had lingered just long enough to compel people to say something. Another patrol officer appeared at the door, following orders to secure the scene. No one was allowed to enter or leave. Those who hadn't paid were asked to remain. The small diner, once a refuge from the harsh midday sun, was now the center of a national incident quietly taking shape. Outside the perimeter, however, the video, recorded by the young customer, had already begun its journey. By the time Vance was still standing in front of the old man, the clip had been shared to a personal page with a short caption, "Cop pulled a gun on an old man just for sitting alone." In the first 10 minutes, it reached 2,000 views. In the next 30 minutes, that number multiplied tenfold. Then it escaped the bounds of the local community, finding its way into civic forums, social justice channels, and platforms that track abuse of power. Inside the diner, the murmurs began. "I think I saw him once," a middle-aged man whispered, hesitantly, at the university auditorium. During a lecture on the Constitution, an older woman in the far corner furrowed her brow. She didn't look at the old man. She stared at the badge, as if trying to summon something from the edge of memory. "Could it be?" she murmured, not daring to finish the thought. Vance remained rooted in place. No longer shouting, no longer commanding, he listened. And for what seemed like the first time, he wasn't hearing anyone else's voice, only the echo inside his mind, something that felt very much like collapse. Not from the outside, but from within. The crumbling of a belief that he had always been right, now quietly undone by the silent presence of a man he had never learned how to respect. The truth was beginning to surface, not because someone shouted, but because, finally, people had started to remember, and this time they couldn't look away. The old man pulled out his chair and sat back down as if nothing had interrupted him. He laid the napkin neatly across his lap once more. In front of him, the plate had gone cold, but no one dared touch it. The badge still rested there, silent beneath furtive glances and a confusion that had not yet found its name. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece, and brought it to his mouth, unhurried, as if to remind everyone that the most vital part of any meal was not the food, but the peace and being allowed to eat it. No one spoke again. No one offered excuses for what had just happened. There were no apologies, no explanations, only an extended discomfort that hung in the air like a fine mist, cloaking the egos that once believed they were right. He looked at no one. He didn't nod. He didn't smile to ease the tension. Nor did he show anger. His gaze rested on the space between the table and the glass window, where sunlight passed through and left faint streaks across the old tile floor. In his mind, he thought, "I don't need them to remember my name. I just need them to remember this lesson." And then he continued eating what was left, as if that was the only thing still whole after a wordless exchange between a man and a system that had just revealed the emptiness at its core. The next morning, before the sunlight had fully filtered through the trees lining the main boulevard, the 40-second clip had surpassed 1 million views. Not because of clickbait. There were no flashy effects, no dramatic soundtrack, just a shaky, low-resolution video from a handheld phone, capturing a black elder standing calmly in front of a police officer's gun, so composed it was suffocating. The hashtag #WhoIsHe first appeared from an anonymous account, accompanied by a simple caption. He didn't yell, he didn't resist, he just stood there, and the whole room changed. Within an hour, the hashtag had spread to more than 10 states. Some users reshared it with captions like, "Don't know who he is, but he made me feel ashamed." Others wrote, "If he didn't have that badge, would he still be alive?" Social media platforms erupted into debate. Users dissected every frame, every line on the badge. A group of law students confirmed it was a rare federal credential, issued only to those who had served as legal advisors or federal judges. A few claimed they had seen him speak at justice seminars, but no one could recall his name. And that, ironically, made the hashtag spread even faster. The question was no longer just about identity. It became, how could someone who once sat atop the legal system be treated this way, just for eating alone in a small-town diner? News outlets began to take notice. First it was local channels, then gradually national papers. Some reporters went to the diner, interviewed witnesses, and tried to trace the old man's steps, but he had left the night before, leaving behind nothing but a badge and a social tremor spreading faster than anyone could track. The online community began sharing personal stories. Black individuals recounted moments when they were pulled over by police for no reason. A young woman posted a photo of her father, also wearing a brown vest, also known for reading books in the park, with the caption, "They always start with name, like it's the most important thing." Within less than 24 hours, "Who is he?" was no longer a question. It had become a symbol, not to idolize the old man, but to serve as a reminder that a truly civilized society does not need to know who you are to decide how you deserve to be treated. 24 hours after the clip had spread across social platforms, the city police department held a brief press conference. There was no apology, no accountability, just a written statement read in a flat tone by a department spokesperson. The emphasized line, "Officer Peter Vance has been placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation. The official identity of the man in the video has not yet been confirmed." The final sentence left many viewers in disbelief. Not yet confirmed. Even though the badge had been captured in close-up, even though hundreds of legal experts had verified the badge's authenticity, even though the internet had collectively concluded that the man had once served as a federal legal advisor, with one vague sentence they attempted to extinguish a fire already spreading, but instead of smothering it, they poured fuel on the flames. Behind the podium lights, a city councilman named Gerald Monroe, a black man who had remained silent through 3 terms to avoid internal disruption, quietly opened a private file. He began collecting complaints that had once been dismissed, especially those involving Officer Vance. Some case files were missing pages. Others bore the label "handled internally." But to Gerald, every fragment mattered. For the first time in years, he felt that if he didn't act now, there would never be a better moment. While officials weighed their wording, ordinary citizens were already telling their own stories online. A middle-aged woman posted a blurry photo from 2009. In it, she was being escorted out of a cafe in a busy neighborhood. The caption simply read, "They said I didn't order fast enough, but I saw white customers who came later still get seated." A man wrote, "I was told to get off a park bench because I didn't have a clear purpose for sitting. I stayed silent, and they said that made me suspicious." The stories came flooding in, not to fan the flames, but to prove that the fire hadn't started with a single match. It was the result of years of dismissed behaviors, interrupted voices, and suspicious glances aimed at those who didn't fit the peaceful profile society had unconsciously constructed. And then, buried among hundreds of comments, one post left readers stunned. An elderly woman named Helen Jenkins, 83 years old, wrote, "He once defended me when I sued a school for racial discrimination in 1987. No one believed me, but he spent the whole afternoon listening." There was no documentation, no official record, just her account, but it didn't need paperwork to be believed. Anyone who had ever been truly listened to by a man like him would never forget it. And her story wasn't just gratitude, it was living proof. This wasn't the first time he had stood in the face of injustice. It was just the first time the world was forced to see it. The breakthrough didn't come from an official news agency, nor from any spokesperson of the justice system. It came from a short post on a legal academic forum, where students and retired professors often shared stories of the figures who had helped shape the U.S. judiciary. An anonymous account, with the display name, The Clerk 97, posted a message containing just 2 sentences. His real name is Reuben Elias Moore. He was once nominated for the United States Supreme Court in 2001. Within an hour, that name saturated search engines. Old files were dredged up. Blurry archived news articles retrieved from National Library databases began to surface. Reuben Elias Moore, the name once spoken as a symbol of hope for reforming the legal system, a man who had taught justice at 3 prestigious universities, and one of the very few black individuals ever considered for a Supreme Court appointment in the past 2 decades. But the strange thing was this: after 2001, his name vanished from all political and legal circles. There was no news about withdrawing his nomination, no press conference to decline the position, no farewell interview, only a silence that stretched for nearly 2 decades, as if he had never existed at that level at all. A veteran journalist named Malik Thompson, who had once covered judicial nominees during that era, dug into his old notes. In a folded, yellowed sheet written by hand, there was a single, distinct line. Moore withdrew right after South Bend. Reason unknown. No one asked. South Bend, a name unfamiliar to the younger generation, but for those who lived through the early 2000s, it was the site of a complex civil rights case involving a black teenager convicted in a highly controversial trial. The case was later sealed. Many believed it was buried for political reasons. And Reuben Moore, the man rumored to have raised internal objections about the constitutional legitimacy of the ruling, stepped back just days after the nomination panel's preliminary vote. No one knew whether he did it under pressure or by personal choice. There was no farewell speech. No one stood to defend him. Only a quiet withdrawal and a silent gap in the list of those who might have changed the system. And now, the man who once stood on the brink of the Supreme Court found himself facing a drawn gun in a small-town diner by an officer who had never read his name in any chapter of legal history. When his identity was confirmed, many were stunned. But for him, perhaps the real tragedy wasn't being forgotten. It was the fact that even having once stood so close to power, he still couldn't escape being seen as a stranger because of his skin, his silence, and the simple truth that they had never truly listened. The fifth-floor conference room of the South Bend Police Department, typically used for dry operational briefings, had become the epicenter of a political storm building by the hour. The glass doors were sealed with drawn blinds. The leather chairs around the table were filled with tense faces. The police chief, unit captains, internal communications staff, and a legal advisor. No outsiders, no press, no union reps, just people inside the system, now forced to face a crisis they had long sown. The chief, an Italian-American man with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor once considered composed, opened the meeting with a simple question. How do we handle this? No one answered right away. One security captain suggested stating fault along with a pledge for internal review. Another officer pushed back, arguing that admitting fault was bleeding out during a credibility war. His reasoning, the online crowd needs just one apology to pounce and we lose control instantly. On the other side of the table, a female legal advisor disagreed. She spoke plainly. Even without an apology, we're not in control. The security footage from the diner will be pulled soon. At that point, the truth will do the rest of the job. Vance sat at the corner of the table, arms crossed, his gaze icy. When asked, he didn't mince words. He deliberately concealed his identity. Vance said, a man who once held that kind of position, refusing to give his name, acting evasive in a public setting, he provoked us. He orchestrated this to damage the department's reputation. No one in the room openly challenged him, but the discomfort was visible. Vance didn't acknowledge fault. He didn't retreat. He saw himself as the victim of a setup. And to some in that room, that mindset was more dangerous than the mistake he had just made. Elsewhere in the city, Ethan sat in his mother's small kitchen. He had just been informed of his temporary reassignment to the logistics division. No public statements, no press interaction. Temporarily barred from wearing his uniform until further notice, in front of him was a cup of peppermint tea his mother had just made. The woman, in her 60s, with graying hair and eyes that still held strength, sat quietly, watching him. She had joined the civil rights movement in the early 80s and had once been arrested during a march in Jackson, but she never spoke much about it. Only when Ethan removed his badge and placed it on the kitchen table did she ask, "What did you see yesterday?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his palms, thinking of Mr. Moore's eyes, of the moment he pulled out the badge, one Ethan hadn't stopped Vance from misreading. A part of him wanted to explain, to say he was new to the force, that he didn't have the authority to challenge a superior, but the words caught in his throat. No one needed to hear them. "Oh, Mom," he said softly, I don't know who I'm serving anymore." His mother nodded. She didn't say, "I know." and she didn't offer, "It'll be okay." Instead, she poured more tea, set the cup in front of him, and said slowly, "You once asked me why people protest, why they endure beatings. And don't give up, because sometimes silence is a form of violence, and sometimes, if you don't stand with the truth, you're still standing on the other side, even if you never meant to." Ethan bowed his head. Inside, something was shifting, not resistance, but a painful awakening. A realization that the uniform he had once worn with pride could just as easily be a symbol of fear if it wasn't carried with awareness. On social media, the video clip was no longer just compelling evidence, it had become the subject of detailed analysis, almost like a documentary being dissected frame by frame. Graphic experts, law students, justice enthusiasts, even anonymous truth diggers joined in, driven by something larger than the story itself, a collective need to witness clearly what many had long suspected, that justice, at times, must be protected from those who claim to serve it. Each frame was extracted, enhanced, color-corrected, and cross-referenced with images from the national database. A small research team of Harvard law students confirmed that the badge Mr. Moore produced was not just a Federal Advisor ID, it was a limited-issue version, one that had only been granted to individuals who participated in strategic internal sessions of the Judicial Ethics Commission, a little-known advisory group for landmark federal rulings. The silver seal in the corner of the badge was a unique edition, issued only between 1997 and 2003, precisely aligning with Reuben Elias Moore's peak years in office. It was no longer a question of identity. It was a statement, a declaration that needed no authorization. Additional footage from the diner's ceiling camera was leaked. The overhead angle, where Mr. Moore had subtly shifted his shoulder, became an iconic image, an elderly man standing tall facing the barrel of a gun wielded by someone authorized to fire, and instead of cowering, he angled himself so the truth could be recorded. No resistance, no retreat. Captions accompanying the clip spread widely. "When he wasn't appointed to the Supreme Court, we lost a judge. But when he had a gun pointed at him at noon, we realized something greater. We had lost a guardian of human dignity." While the nation still simmered with the revelation of his identity, Reuben left the city. There was no press conference, no handwritten letter to the authorities, no responses to any of the dozens of journalists trying to reach him. He didn't carry much, just an old canvas bag, a few changes of clothes, a leather-bound book, and the badge, now tucked away in a small case, no longer displayed as it had been the day before. He hired a car that took back roads, quietly heading north toward a small woodland town where almost no one recognized him. There, a few miles from a still lake, stood an old wooden house. Its walls were moss-covered, the roof tiles sun-bleached, and the porch swing sat waiting as if someone had never truly left. This was not a place of hiding. It was the place he had always returned to whenever the system made him weary. It was where he once reread old rulings, where he had written memoirs, never published, and now it had become a place for him to reflect on what had just unfolded, not as a victim, but as a witness, that the system he had once served was still not ready to accept people like him. No matter who he was, no matter what position he had held, in the eyes of the prejudiced, he remained a shadow, not allowed to exist in peace. Reuben sat on the wooden steps out front, the breeze carrying the scent of pine through the air. Before him lay a lake as still as glass, reflecting what he had always known, that sometimes what we leave behind isn't in the verdicts, but in how we hold ourselves steady amid the chaos. Here, no one asked his name. No one drew a weapon. No one required proof. Only nature remained, silent and steadfast, just like the way he had chosen to be present in a world not always ready to listen. And it was here, in this place seemingly untouched by the storm outside, that the groundwork for a larger twist would quietly begin to take shape as forgotten secrets began to resurface in ways no one could predict. Less than 48 hours after Reuben Elias Moore's identity was confirmed, the media wave split into two clear directions: On major television networks, from morning shows to primetime segments, the calm face of the elderly man appeared repeatedly, now accompanied by increasingly provocative headlines. No longer asking, "Who is the man held at gunpoint during lunch?" the banners shifted to "Supreme Court near nominee victim" or "Master of Media Manipulation." Civil liberties leading outlets like WCPN, Echo Voice, and The Root quickly came to his defense. They emphasized the truth didn't lie in the badge he carried, but in the way a person had been treated simply for not fitting the societal mold of who was allowed to exist unchallenged. They replayed ceiling camera footage, quoted witnesses from the diner, and cited detailed video analyses of Vance's expressions, revealing an aggression that could not be justified as protocol. However, on conservative channels, the narrative was entirely reversed. Talk show hosts began to push pointed questions. Why would someone who once held such a high position choose not to disclose his identity from the start? Some reporters even adopted a mocking tone. Strange how a man who supposedly understands the power of the law chooses silence with the police. Was it a test? A performance? On social media, the comments began to turn venomous. Under posts sharing the story, sarcastic remarks surfaced. He knew exactly what that badge would trigger. Across the country, one user wrote, "Another case of playing the race card for privilege." Another added, "If he were just a regular man without a supreme badge, would anyone care?" The polarization extended beyond the comment sections. It crept into the way headlines were written, the way images of Rubin were selected. Some outlets chose photos of him sitting on a park bench, reading under soft light. Others used the frame where he faced the gun, blurring the badge to create a sense of ambiguity. Every angle carried intent, and every intent revived a bias long embedded. Meanwhile, Rubin gave no response. He issued no open letter. He appointed no legal spokesperson. He made no effort to confirm or refute anything. His silence became an excuse for both sides to spin the story in their preferred direction. One side cast him as a dignified figure, humiliated. The other portrayed him as a mastermind who baited the system, showing up quietly, withholding his name, concealing his background, and striking when no one was prepared. And caught in this battle for narrative was the very truth that had first demanded attention, that a man whose face once commanded respect in the highest chambers of power had lived through a lunch hour where his life was determined not by cause, but by assumption. Some recognized that truth, but they lacked the voice to make it heard, because by now, the media had taken sides, and Rubin Moore, despite not saying a single word, was being pushed back and forth like a pawn on a board he no longer wished to play on. Amid the swelling noise, with public discourse growing louder and more divided, and the public itself growing weary from being cornered into extreme choices, a human rights organization called Watch and Word quietly spoke up. No grand announcements, no fiery declarations, just a handwritten letter sent to the address believed to be Rubin's lakeside retreat. It opened with a single, simple sentence: "You don't have to speak, but your presence might help others find the courage to listen." Watch and Word is an independent organization founded after the Ferguson incident by a group of former attorneys, educators, and civil rights activists. They don't chase social media trends, nor do they play PR games. Instead, they specialize in hosting public dialogues between victims and representatives of the system, not to assign blame, but to create space for understanding. The invitation sent to Rubin came with no conditions. No cameras, no questions. All they asked was that he show up, sit in the front row, and be a silent witness for those who were ready to share their own stories. He declined, not out of pride and not to avoid confrontation, but because he knew that his presence at this moment would be co-opted by hundreds of political agendas. He didn't want the story turned into a symbol. He had been part of the system. He understood how the system used symbol-making as a way to sidestep the core of the problem. He didn't want to become a name that replaced real action. So he quietly wrote a short reply: "I will not come, but I am not retreating." In his place, it was Sofia Ramirez who showed up to meet with Watch and Word, a young attorney with short black hair, sharp eyes, and a steady presence. She had once been a student of Reuben's during a rare seminar he taught after stepping away from public service. She was 22 at the time, seated in the front row, and had asked him, "How do you stay soft in a system that's already gone hard?" He answered her with a sentence she carried through her entire career. "Don't bring anger into court. Bring a question no one's dared to ask." Sophia had grown up in an immigrant family, having once seen her father treated like a thief just for asking why he was being held at a gas station late at night. She didn't study law to litigate, but to redesign the very procedures she believed had been built without people like her in mind. Now, at 31, she was one of Watch and Word's lead representatives. After Reuben declined, Sophia appeared in a live public forum. No slogans, no tearful retelling of the incident. She simply said, "He doesn't need to be here, because he once showed up exactly when so many of us needed him, and now it's our turn to show up for him." That sentence was clipped and shared across thousands of personal pages, but to Sophia, none of that mattered as much as preserving the spirit Reuben once instilled in her, that justice doesn't come from whoever yells the loudest, but from the one who dares to hold a question long enough until it becomes action. And in this unfolding story, she knew her role wasn't to speak for him, but to ensure he wasn't misrepresented. The sun had just begun to set when Sophia Ramirez parked outside the lakeside cabin. The still water behind it reflected a faint orange hue, casting a peace over the place that felt almost unreal compared to the storm unraveling beyond. She hadn't called ahead, brought no recording device, no prepared documents, just a small backpack, dusted shoes, and an expression filled with a kind of emotion even she couldn't name: anger, disappointment, or the ache of a student who had once believed in something absolute. Reuben opened the door before she could knock. No surprise, no question as to why she had come. He simply nodded and stepped aside, a quiet gesture of welcome, just like every time he had appeared in her life before. Never loud, never forceful, but always leaving an impact. They sat across from each other in the small wooden room, lit only by the glow of an old oil lamp and the sound of pine needles rustling outside the window. Sophia didn't waste time. She looked directly at him, not hiding the tension in her voice. "Why did you disappear when we needed you most?" Reuben didn't answer right away. He poured tea, placed the cup before her, and then sat down. His eyes didn't avert, but they didn't confront either. Just the calm silence of someone who had heard that question more times than anyone had dared to ask it. Sophia continued, each word pressed tight. "The entire system collapsed over one wrongful ruling, and you were silent." She was referring to a civil rights case that had once shaken the legal world nearly 2 decades prior, a case many believed could have been the foundation for reform had it not been buried under political maneuvering, and Reuben Elias Moore, then among the senior legal advisors, was the last person expected to step away. But he had vanished quietly just before the final deliberation, leaving no explanation behind. Reuben took a sip of tea. His hand was steady. His voice was low, rasped, but firm. "I was alone, in a room where everyone knew what was happening was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to say it." Sophia clenched her fists. She had imagined this moment many times. In her version, he would say he'd been forced out, that he had no choice, that he'd been betrayed. But his answer made her even angrier. So that was enough reason to walk away?" she asked. "We were your students. The people were voters. An entire generation was waiting for something from those like you. And then you disappeared, as if it never really mattered." Reuben looked at her for a long time, then set his teacup down on the table. He spoke slowly, like someone not only answering Sophia, but also speaking to the years he had spent in silence. "I didn't disappear because it didn't matter. I disappeared because it mattered too much to be destroyed in a battle I knew I couldn't win. Back then, I wasn't strong enough to stand alone and hold the line on what was right. So I chose to step back so that, at the very least, the truth might have a chance to survive for another day." Sophia didn't respond, but in her eyes, for the first time in years, something surfaced, a wound finally named, disappointment. Not because her mentor had once been weak, but because he had taken the truth with him when he left, never knowing that she, and so many others, had been waiting for him to stay and fight. When Sophia left, carrying the silence still lingering from a conversation that hadn't truly ended, Reuben remained alone on the wooden porch, the night breeze from the lake brushing gently against his collar. In his hand was the old cup of tea, now cold. In front of him the vast water lay still and silent, like a mirror that didn't reflect, but simply reminded him of what had already passed. Reuben closed his eyes. In his memory, the winter of 1997 returned like a blade being pulled slowly from flesh. South Bend, a small industrial town in the southern part of the state, had become the nation's focus when a 16-year-old black boy was accused of killing a white man. No witnesses, no weapon, only a confession extracted after 12 hours of interrogation without a lawyer. The entire case rested on that confession, but Reuben knew too well how the system sometimes produces confessions not out of guilt, but out of despair. When the case file reached the Federal Legal Advisory Group, of which he was a member, he read through the entire transcript, the recordings, and the psychological reports that had been submitted late, and he knew that the boy had no one, no real defense. No one believed him, and most importantly, no one was willing to stand up and say the conviction was unconstitutional. In a closed-door session, most of his colleagues, figures of significant power in the legal world, voted in favor of the prosecution. Their reason? Insufficient grounds for a public challenge. A polished way of saying, we don't want to stir the media at a sensitive time. Reuben was the sole dissenting vote. He objected with a 12-page memorandum, citing countless provisions on the right to legal counsel, the right to remain silent, and precedents involving minors. But no one responded. No one debated. They simply stayed silent, and then they moved on. The file was closed. The boy was sentenced to life in prison with no real chance of appeal. A few days after that session, Reuben resigned. He held no press conference, gave no interviews. He wrote a handwritten letter to the chair of the council, containing only one line: I stood alone, and they broke me without needing to say a word. No one asked further. No one pressed. They let him go easily, as if his presence had never been necessary, and to him that was the greatest failure, not because he lost a vote, but because he had allowed the system to continue without forcing it to look at itself. Years later, when asked why he never returned, never kept pushing, never joined a movement, he gave a short answer, because when silence wins once, it will demand to win again. But now, with the diner incident bringing his name back into the world, Reuben understood. He no longer had the chance to step back again. The past was no longer just the past. It was a verdict waiting to be reopened, and this time he might not be the one filing the appeal, but at the very least, he would not sit quietly while it was being read. Sophia returned to Watch and Word late that night, her head still buzzing from the meeting with Reuben. She wasn't sure if she was sad, angry, or simply disappointed that the teacher she once revered had chosen to quietly step away when he should have stood his ground. But beneath those personal emotions, she knew she had to do something the system had never wanted anyone to do: dig up a past that had never been properly recorded. She spent the next 2 full days in the organization's legal archive. Boxes of old case files, internal documents, memoranda from civil rights lawsuits, some folders yellowed with age, some once marked restricted, and there, between misaligned typewritten pages and faded carbon copies, she found one file wrapped separately in a hard cover, marked with handwritten initials, SB97RJM. Inside was an audio recording, accompanied by a handwritten transcript. It was the minutes of a closed-door meeting of the Federal Judicial Advisory Group, the meeting Reuben had once mentioned, where he was the sole vote against convicting the black teenager in South Bend. The recording was incomplete, but there was one section that made Sophia nearly stop breathing when she heard it. Moore won't go along with this. Then push him out. Soft if by procedure, hard if by politics. The governor already has someone ready to replace him. The voices in the recording were not identified by name, but the attached memorandum included a set of initials, J.W. and Sophia, who had once written her senior thesis on the structure of federal judicial power, knew exactly who that referred to. Judge Julian Whitmore, a senior justice who once sat on the Central Judicial Council and was now the sitting federal legal advisor. Whitmore wasn't just powerful, he was famously discreet, known for helping design policies to shield law enforcement from political pressure, and most notably, he was the direct signatory for federal training budgets that funded cooperation with state police departments, including South Bend, where Vance had attended a tactical coordination course in 2015. Sophia stood frozen. The connections were too clear. Not a coincidence, but a cycle. Rubin had once been pushed out of the system for daring to oppose a wrongful conviction. The man who pushed him out still held a high seat with authority over the legal system, and Vance, the officer who had pointed a gun at him in a simple diner, was not just a man with personal bias. He was, perhaps, a long-term product of the very policies designed to suppress dissent, policies created by Whitmore. Sophia held the transcript in her hands, motionless. She understood now. Vance's actions were not a single misstep. They were a systemic repetition protected by a structure of power that had gone unchallenged for decades. Rubin was not merely an old man insulted over lunch. He was the unfinished punctuation of a story that had been deliberately left hanging, and this time they had made a mistake in assuming that man no longer carried weight, because now he no longer stood alone. Sophia took a deep breath. She knew she was holding a piece of the key, not to restore Rubin's honor, but to expose something the system had spent years concealing. That abuse of power does not live only in actions. It is sustained by intentional silence. And Rubin, this time, would not be silent. Sophia didn't send the documents to major news outlets. She knew exactly how mainstream media operated. Everything would be edited, diluted, or buried under a neutral headline. Instead, she chose to upload the recording to Watch and Word's independent podcast channel, a platform trusted by its community for saying the things traditional newsrooms were too cautious to print. The episode lasted only 8 minutes. It opened with Sophia's voice, firm but not angry. "We are not speaking on behalf of Mr. Rubin Moore. We're simply reopening a door that was once slammed shut because someone didn't want you to know what was behind it." Then she played the recording. "Moore won't go along with this. Then push him out. Soft if by procedure, hard if by politics. The governor already has someone ready to replace him. No effects, no music, just the sound of voices in some closed room from over 20 years ago. And yet, those words, echoing into the year 2025, cut like a blade through the mask of a system the public had long suspected but only dared to question in silence. Within just 2 hours of the episode going live, dozens of young lawyers reshared it. Independent journalists began digging into Judge Whitmore's personnel records, citing every line of budget he had ever approved, tracing the links between the Federal Budget Committee and the internal tactical training networks of police departments. An anonymous account specializing in judicial oversight posted a brief but powerful message. He was pushed out for daring to say no to the system. Now the system is afraid because he's still alive. The broadcast channel surpassed 100,000 listens in just half a day, and in the comments section, people were no longer asking who was that old man. Instead, they began to ask, how many more like him have they silenced? Rubin made no public comment, but when Sophia called to report the growing impact, he paused for a moment, then said, "Don't rush to conclusions. This isn't the end. It's the part they fear most, the moment the truth starts to have a name." The following morning, the South Bend Police Department held a sudden press conference. Behind the podium stood the national flag and the department's insignia. Both flags stretched unusually taut, as if their symmetry could compensate for what was about to be said. The police chief, who had remained silent throughout the incident, appeared with a visibly strained expression. Beside him stood the department's in-house counsel and the media liaison, holding a printed document marked confidential. The chief began, his voice straining to sound composed. "We want to state clearly that the video circulating on social media does not reflect the full context of what took place at the diner that day. The clip was edited, and the release of partial truths can lead to serious misunderstandings." The moment that statement ended, social media erupted into fierce debate. They did not deny that the incident had occurred. They did not refute the presence of the gun or Vance's threats, but they questioned Mr. Reuben Moore's initial demeanor. A report of unknown origin began circulating from an anonymous account, claiming the elderly man refused to cooperate from the start, that he deliberately delayed identification, and even behaved ambiguously in ways that made the officer feel threatened. Worse, some evening commentary shows began airing isolated clips, replaying the moment Mr. Moore reached into his jacket pocket. They did not mention that it was a judicial badge. They did not clarify that he moved slowly, under full lighting, with no hostile gestures. They only asked, "Is it reasonable for an ordinary citizen to carry a metallic object without informing the police?" From there, a new label began to spread across biased platforms: "The man inciting racial division." Some anonymously authored opinion pieces, posing as academic commentary, began planting doubt. Who is Mr. Moore to be above suspicion? Is it because he once held a high position that we immediately assume he can do no wrong? Reuben remained silent, but Watch and Word did not. Sophia published a short article, beginning with a pointed rebuttal. A single clip doesn't tell the whole story, but when the story involves a gun aimed at an unarmed, non-resistant man, what more context do you need? The article spread widely, but so did the pressure. Conservative groups demanded a background investigation into Mr. Moore. Some even filed petitions for an inquiry, claiming abuse of former status to manipulate public opinion. One television network went so far as to label the event a scripted political spectacle. In the fog of media manipulation, the most dangerous thing was not the direct slander, it was the seeded doubt. Is there something we don't know? Was Mr. Moore just a victim? It was an old tactic. Cast a shadow on the character of the victim to blur the blood on the hands of those in power. And this time, they were using it against a man who had spent a lifetime proving the opposite. The article appeared quietly on a nearly forgotten blog called Civic Ledger. The author was Malik Thompson, a retired investigative journalist who had covered civil rights cases throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. He had been retired for nearly 10 years, living quietly, posting nothing online, refusing interviews. But that morning, an editorial with a short, piercing title appeared on his page: "I know who he is. I was there." In the article, Malik recounted in detail what happened during the 1997 hearing in South Bend, the case that the media never revisited. He spoke of Reuben Elias Moore, the only one to stand against the conviction of the black teenager. He described the look in Reuben's eyes as he held the 12-page memorandum, reading aloud section by section in a room full of people who chose to look away. He recounted Reuben's final words in that closed meeting, words never made public until now. If justice is something we only protect when it's easy, then what we are preserving isn't law, it's power. Malik confirmed that he had been instructed not to go in depth on the case, that one of his articles had been pulled the day before it was set to print. He closed the piece with a question that left thousands of readers stunned into silence. Does justice still live within this system, or only in the memory of men like him? The article spread rapidly across forums, shared by professors, law students, and those who had witnessed firsthand the failures of the system. Within 12 hours, it became the most quoted piece in national discussions, podcasts, and criminal justice classrooms across the country. Malik did not attempt to cast Mr. Moore as a hero. He simply documented what history had tried to forget, and it was that honesty that forced a doubtful society to take a hard look inward. If justice is not protected through action, does it exist at all, outside the stories of those left behind? After Malik Thompson's editorial went viral and the recording released by Sophia was independently verified, Public pressure exploded like an unstoppable flood. Within 3 days, over 50,000 signatures were sent to the office of the federal counsel demanding an independent investigation into the South Bend incident. But it wasn't just the public speaking out. This time, lawmakers could no longer remain silent. A bipartisan group of legislators, led by Senator Marla Jennings from the state of Maryland and Representative Raymond Chu from California, formally proposed an independent hearing on abuse of power and internal shielding mechanisms within local police forces. They did not name Reuben Moore in the resolution, but everyone understood that the diner incident and the revelations tied to the 1997 South Bend case had ignited the call. The petition began with a quote from Malak Thompson himself: "Justice cannot be something we fix after it fractures. It must be examined before it breaks." The proposed hearing was not limited to the current case, but extended to the entire framework of internal handling procedures, long criticized as loopholes that bury misconduct under vague reports and closed-door settlements. Simultaneously, a team of independent investigative journalists, led by staff from the Sentinel, began digging into Officer Vance's personnel records, and they uncovered something many within the legal community had once whispered about, but no one had dared expose. In the year 2012, at a university in the state of Iowa, Vance, then acting as a tactical support officer at a political lecture, was sued for using unjustified force against an African-American student named Jordan Whitaker. According to the complaint, Jordan had merely been recording video on his phone when Vance shoved him to the ground, restrained his arms, and dragged him off campus. Medical reports confirmed Jordan suffered a dislocated wrist and bruising around the shoulder area. The incident was later resolved internally. Jordan was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a full scholarship covering the remainder of the academic year. Vance was never investigated. No formal disciplinary record was filed. When the Sentinel released the hospital report and the long-forgotten short video, public reaction was swift and outraged. This was no longer a first-time mistake. It was a pattern of behavior, systemic in nature, and proof that Vance had repeatedly used force, particularly against black individuals, without ever facing real consequences. The question arose everywhere: who protected him all these years? And that question only drew more attention to the link between Vance and Judge Whitmore, a man who had long held significant influence over the recruitment and training of senior officers within local enforcement. The pieces began to fit together. This was no longer an isolated case. It was a vicious cycle of power, silence, and recurrence. And this time, the cycle was beginning to unravel in public view. On the upper floor of an empty parking garage at night, under the dim yellow haze of overhead lights, Ethan, the young officer who had accompanied Vance during the diner incident, stepped forward, his cap pulled low, one hand gripping the pocket of his coat. Across from him stood Sofia Ramirez, leaning against the railing, saying nothing, watching him with a gaze that held expectation. She knew this moment could be a turning point, or it could be yet another chapter where silence wins again. Ethan took a long breath, then spoke plainly, without hesitation. "I stayed silent then, but I can't stay silent forever." He recounted everything, from the moment Vance drew his gun to the sickening realization that Mr. Moore had done nothing wrong, yet was treated as a threat. Ethan admitted he had been coached beforehand: if the subject does not comply immediately, assume a defensive stance. But when he saw the calm in Reuben's eyes and the way he deliberately turned toward the camera, Ethan knew this wasn't a situation to default to conditioned response. This was a truth that needed protecting. Sophia didn't interrupt. When Ethan finished, she asked gently, "Are you willing to testify?" He nodded. "If I don't speak up now, then I'll always be part of that silence." Ethan's emergence as an insider witness didn't just bring a new voice to the case, it created a fracture from within the very system itself. Within days, leaks confirmed that a young officer had agreed to cooperate with the independent investigation. The balance began to shift. People who had hesitated to come forward now had a reason to move. Across the country, in the old cabin by the lake, Reuben received a letter. No sender, no envelope, just a single sheet of paper, folded neatly and left on his doorstep, as if someone had quietly come in the night and vanished. Inside was one short handwritten line without punctuation: "If you speak to someone who won't live." Reuben read it over and over, not because he didn't understand, but because he knew this kind of threat well. He had seen it in the early years, defending clients the system had discarded. He had received anonymous letters when he stood up in civil rights lawsuits, but it had been a long time since he was the kind of man anyone felt the need to threaten. He had been silent for too long, and so the arrival of this letter brought with it a feeling he had not expected. He smiled. For the first time since the beginning of all this, it was not a bitter smile, not a smirk, but a quiet nod to himself, as if to affirm that he knew he was heading in the right direction. He spoke softly, like a confession to the darkness surrounding him. If they still need to use threats, it means the truth still holds power. Then he folded the paper, placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. He did not burn it. He did not hide it. He simply left it there, as evidence that even after all these years they were still afraid of what he carried. Not power, not title, but an uncorrupted memory. And this time, he would keep it alive to the very end. The hearing was held at a federal building in the Capitol. Unlike formal court sessions, there were no judges in robes, no gavels struck 3 times to begin. But the chamber was arranged like a tribunal of conscience. Every seat filled, live cameras from 3 angles, and a long table, where those once silenced were finally allowed to speak. Reuben Elias Moore entered the room in a simple brown suit. No badge, no insignia. He was introduced by a white congresswoman from Ohio, who offered a brief statement. He was once a legal advisor to this system. Today he is a living witness to the truth that the system once rejected. The atmosphere was heavy as lead when he took his seat and placed an old leather-bound notebook in front of him. No one asked him to swear an oath. No one forced him to follow any formal sequence. But when he spoke, the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. "There is something I have kept silent about for 28 years. He said, "because I believed that if I didn't speak of it, the system would correct itself, but it hasn't." He spoke of the year 1997 when he served as counsel on a civil rights case in South Bend, a case involving a black teenager sentenced to life imprisonment based solely on a confession made in an interrogation room without legal counsel. He recalled the internal meeting where all his colleagues, some of whom had taught constitutional law, some who had stood proudly on stages honoring the justice system, chose silence, and he, the lone dissenter to the verdict, was quietly removed from every nomination list within days. From his notebook he pulled out a quarter-folded sheet of paper. The edges were worn, and the color faded with time. His voice was deep, slow, but steady. "This is a copy of the statement I once intended to read before the panel, but at the time the chair asked me to put it away. They said, 'It won't change anything, and it makes people uncomfortable.'" Then he read aloud, "We cannot use power to conceal injustice and call it order. If the law is not wide enough to include those who are not like us, then it is not a law. It is a weapon." The room was utterly silent. No one moved. Some bowed their heads, others brought their hands to their mouths. In the audience seating, Sophia sat upright, her eyes fixed on him. She knew that every word he was reading had been buried by the system for over 20 years, and was now being spoken not to expose pain, but to reclaim justice in the very language that had once forgotten it. Reuben paused. He did not apologize for his silence, nor did he accuse anyone. He simply closed the notebook, placed his hand on its cover, and said, "I'm not asking to make amends. I only want the system to know it had a chance, and it missed it. This time, I won't let it forget." The room remained silent a while longer, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone was forced to face something now painfully clear, that justice does not live in the verdict. It lives in the one who dares to repeat the truth, even when silenced, even when there is nothing left to lose. The hearing, expected to end after Reuben's powerful testimony, instead fractured, not from outrage or protest, but from the quiet weight of his words. which, without demanding action, had cracked something open at the very heart of the council itself. One day after the hearing, the Bipartisan Human Rights Council held a closed-door session. The atmosphere was no longer unified. Senator Marla Jennings was the first to stand, calling for a full reopening of the South Bend 1997 case files, along with a request to extract all decisions marked as internally reviewed from that same period. "We need to know how many other Rubens there have been," she said, "and how many verdicts were kept quiet to preserve what they called systemic order." But some members pushed back. A senator from Texas objected. "Exposing too much will shake public confidence in the current system. We can't turn the courts into a battlefield of the past." A quiet yet heated debate erupted. One side argued that the truth must be exposed to cleanse the institution. The other feared that such actions would further erode the already fragile public faith in justice. This divide was no longer along party lines. It was between those willing to confront the past and those determined to bury it deeper. While internal conflict simmered, an unexpected twist shifted the trajectory. One evening, at the Watch and Word office, Sophia received a message from an unknown number. It contained just one line: "I'm ready to tell the truth. My name is Franklin." The next morning, the man arrived, middle-aged, tall, dark-skinned, in plain clothes. On paper, he was Officer David Franklin, a former colleague of Vance for many years. No longer in the force, he had resigned 3 years earlier, abruptly, without a clear explanation. But today, he sat across from Sophia, voice steady and cold as sharpened stone. "This wasn't the first time. I've seen him do it to 3 people. Franklin spoke about the field training sessions that Vance personally organized, sessions that were undocumented, unsupervised. During these, Vance would select black individuals walking alone in parks, at bus stops, or outside restaurants as rapid response targets. The reason listed in reports was suspicious behavior, but in truth it was simply a way for Vance to rehearse control and intimidation without the constraints of simulated drills. "Home time," Franklin said. "A college kid was just sitting on a bench reading. Vance walked up, shined a flashlight in his face, ordered him to raise his hands, searched his pockets, then wrote in the report, 'Displayed ambiguous behavior.' There was nothing in his pockets. The kid was on the verge of tears." Sophia interrupted. "Did you ever report this?" Franklin nodded. "I submitted 2 reports. Both were returned. I was verbally warned, don't include anything unnecessary. After that, I resigned." When Franklin's statement reached the independent legal team, they quickly cross-referenced his personnel files, missing supervision logs, and a series of internal alerts left unanswered between 2014 and 2019. Everything matched. Franklin's words weren't just credible. They exposed a systematic abuse strategy masked as tactical practice. And that whistleblower moment shattered the fragile rebuttals from the conservative bloc within the council. This is no longer about one individual. This is a chain of behavior that was nurtured, shielded, and encouraged. Once again, the question was no longer, "Who is Reuben Moore?" It had become, "How many more Vances are being protected behind those medals?" And this time, that question echoed from within the very system they once believed to be unshakable. Sophia knew the case did not end with Vance. What Franklin disclosed, along with the sealed records, was only the tip of a submerged iceberg. She and the independent investigative team at Watch and Word worked for weeks, cross-referencing data, suspended investigation reports, internally resolved complaint files, maintenance budgets for surveillance equipment, rerouted for other uses, and then, all those fragmented pieces aligned into a disturbing picture, an underground network designed to protect and sustain the influence of officers with histories of racial misconduct. In a closed press briefing, Sophia released a nearly 60-page internal document. It contained a list of officers previously accused of abuse of power, with brief notes on the outcomes of their cases. Notably, nearly 20 names repeated over the past decade. Among them, Peter Vance appeared 5 times, with 3 complaints of racial bias, all marked as reassigned, internally handled, or closed due to lack of evidence. The most critical section of the document revealed links between these officers and a policy advocacy group named the American Order Alliance, AAA, a conservative right-wing organization headquartered in Idaho, known for its fierce opposition to what it labeled as anti-police sentiment and its lobbying against systemic reform. Financial data from AOA showed the organization had quietly funded local police associations, directly providing scholarships and equipment to departments with members targeted by the media for political reasons. One leaked internal report from AOA stated plainly, "We must maintain field strength. An officer capable of enforcement is a strategic asset." Sophia pointed to that very line during her presentation and concluded, Peter Vance is not an isolated incident. He is part of a system cultivated to continue discriminating, to continue threatening, and to continue being protected. Immediately following the press briefing, the phrase, "the SHIELD network," began trending across social media, referring to the protective web shielding those who claim to serve the law while corroding it from within. Once again, the public no longer asked, "Who is Vance?" They began asking, "How many systems exist solely to preserve power for those unfit to carry a weapon?" And this time, silence was no longer an option. The shock came Tuesday morning. Judge Henry Mallory, 81 years old, who once served on the Federal Judicial Council from the 1990s through the early 2000s, unexpectedly appeared at a solo press conference in Washington, D.C. No legal spokesperson, no press secretary, just him, a modest wooden podium, and a few scattered reporters who, at first, weren't sure it was real. During 3 decades of service, Mallory had been regarded as a keeper of order in complex cases, but was also known for his discretion and conservatism. That's why, when he stood before the public with a thin folder and a heavy gaze, everyone understood something significant was about to be said. He opened with a brief sentence, "I was a colleague of Reuben Elias Moore, and today I speak for what we did not dare say 28 years ago." Then he confessed everything, that in the South Bend case of 1997 he and other council members chose silence, not because they didn't see injustice, but because they feared losing their positions, feared being pushed out of the expanding political apparatus, especially under pressure from conservative groups at the time. Reuben was the only one in that room who dared to say the sentence was wrong. We avoided his eyes, avoided responsibility, and let that boy disappear into the system. We were wrong, and I was wrong. The confession pressed down on the air in the room. No one applauded, no one cheered, because that truth, though courageous, came too late. Yet it was the final piece confirming Reuben had been right from the beginning, and he had been pushed out because of that very rightness. Less than 12 hours after Mallory's press conference, major cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Philadelphia, and even South Bend saw the rise of peaceful protests. There was no violence, no incendiary slogans, just people dressed in black, holding white signs with one simple sentence, "Silence is complicity." In front of the South Bend Police Department, hundreds stood in a circle, not shouting, not blocking streets. They stood silently for 3 minutes, symbolizing the 3 times Reuben Moore had been denied the opportunity to speak before the public over nearly 3 decades. When the bell rang, marking the end of those 3 minutes, they chanted in unison, "We are silent no more." At City Hall, a group of law students staged a public reading reenactment of the 1997 South Bend hearing, using the original draft of the defense Reuben had written but was forbidden to present. Beside them stood a large placard bearing a quote from Moloch Thompson, "Justice cannot live in the shadow of fear." On social media, the hashtag "No Longer Silent" quickly spread, accompanied by stories from those who had once been mistreated by law enforcement but had never dared to speak out. Now they spoke, not for revenge, but to reclaim the space that silence had once occupied. And among the crowds were people who did not protest. They just stood, holding images of Reuben Moore, not as a saint, but as a witness. A man who once stood alone in the middle of a system that turned its back. When Ethan decided to testify, many saw it as the brave act of a newly awakened rookie. but few knew he had already been written off by the system early on. During an internal audit conducted by an independent investigative group, a first-year performance review of Ethan was leaked. In the section Evaluating Promotion Potential, a supervising officer had written in red ink, "Needs further review, displays signs of being unsuitable for a strong enforcement environment." At first glance, it seemed like standard bureaucratic phrasing, but when retired officers began decoding internal terminology, the truth surfaced. Strong enforcement was a euphemism used within the force to describe hardline behavior, particularly toward people of color, even when no legitimate reason existed. Amid testimonies, hearings, and underground reports gradually being brought to light, one crucial piece was nearly forgotten forever. A homeless man named Clarence Boyd, who wandered around the South Bend bus terminal and had directly witnessed Vance's violence in 2019. That day, he was sitting and eating a sandwich handed out by a local outreach center when he saw something he could never forget: a black teenager, around 15 years old, being shoved against a wall near the alley behind the bus station by Vance. That kid didn't do anything, just had his headphones on, head down, walking. Vance yelled, then pushed him down, pinned him by the neck, punched his shoulder, and Clarence recalled in the raspy voice of someone who had lived too long in the margins. Clarence ran to the police station to file a report with all the courage he could muster. But instead of being recorded, his testimony was deemed unreliable. A desk officer briefly wrote in the report, "Police investigated and found no misconduct. Informant appears mentally unstable." And just like that, his account, along with whatever value his life once had, was pushed aside. No one called him back. No investigation followed, and the teenager from that day disappeared from the system, unnamed and unaccounted for. Sophia knew that if what Clarence said was true, this could serve as evidence that Vance's violent conduct was not only recurring, but had once been worn about and deliberately buried. With support from Ethan, who had now become a key collaborator in Watch and Word's investigative team, she requested access to the complaint intake logs from 2019. They faced repeated delays and rejections, but eventually, they located a manually stored folder in South Bend PD's legacy archive. Inside were handwritten reports, faded ink, and carbon copy pages from years past. Among them was a single-page intake form with Clarence Boyd's name misspelled and a note scribbled in the margins. Claims saw officer use force, no ID provided, no further action required. That sheet had never been digitized. It had never been logged into the case system. It was buried, but it existed. And in that single sheet of neglected testimony, Sophia saw more than just evidence. She saw the pattern. A witness was dismissed not because he lied, but because he didn't look like someone worth believing. And in doing so, the system protected not the public, but its silence. Amid the pile of old files, a complaint form without a case number surfaced. Written in pencil, the faded handwriting included the line, "Informant Clarence B." The strange part was, instead of being stamped, processed, or archived, the upper corner of the document bore a scribbled red note, "Internal hold, do not enter into system." Sophia froze. This wasn't a record forgotten. It had been deliberately hidden, not because of a lack of evidence, but because the person speaking was Clarence, a man invisible in the eyes of the system. Sophia looked at Ethan. He nodded, eyes heavy. It's not that they didn't see, they just didn't want to see him. That file, a thin sheet that had never been processed, had now become a key piece, not to prosecute Vance for a single incident, but to prove what Sophia had said again and again. The system wasn't careless. It made a choice, and it chose not to believe those deemed unworthy of being heard. Clarence, once labeled unstable, had now become the final witness helping confirm a hard truth. History isn't inaccurate because of missing witnesses. It is inaccurate because those witnesses were never allowed to exist within the truth. The clip aired at the end of an independent podcast episode. No ads, no sensational headlines. The footage was shaky, dimly lit, capturing a man seated on a wooden bench, the peeling wall of a homeless outreach center behind him. In front of the camera was Clarence Boyd, gray hair matted from the rain, thin hands clasped tightly together, but his voice steady. He spoke without drama, no tears, just the kind of clarity that comes from carrying something too long. They looked at me and saw nothing worth writing down. But that kid, he mattered. I saw it. So did the man who came after. That man didn't ask for proof. He just listened. The screen faded to black with only one line of text remaining. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone who won't look away. They said I was unstable. I imagined things, that I wasn't clear-headed enough to be believed. But I can't forget that day. Can't forget that boy's eyes. He looked up, straight into the lens. His eyes didn't tremble. They held no anger, only a kind of weariness that had long gone quiet. I don't know that boy's name, but I saw his eyes, just like Mr. Moore's when that gun was pointed at him. Like he wasn't a person anymore, just an object they needed to clear out of the way. That moment, only a few dozen seconds, but it struck deeper than any expert commentary, because those words didn't come from a scholar, a politician, or someone who had ever stood behind a podium of power. They came from someone who had nothing to lose but a memory carried far too long. The clip was reshared by Watch and Word with no caption, no editing. Within 6 hours, the footage had millions of views. But what no one expected was that it would ignite a wave unlike anything before. Just one day later, the first to step forward was a woman named Renee Hightower, an elementary school teacher in Arkansas. She posted a short video recounting how police once asked her to leave the parking lot of her school just because she had sat in her car too long without getting out. I wasn't hit, no gun was pulled, but the way they looked at me, like I didn't have a legitimate reason to be there, like my skin was suspicious behavior. Then came a doctor, a law student, a single mother, and a late-night delivery driver. None of them had ever been at the center of public discourse, but after Clarence's video, they realized they no longer had to speak in silence. They told stories of being asked to pop their trunks for no reason, of the stares when walking into a restaurant, of random radio calls from patrolling officers, of their children's backpacks being searched at school simply for suspicion of carrying something unusual. Mainstream media, which had long been cautious in how they reported such stories, could no longer look away. They began airing shortened versions of the testimonies, organizing roundtable discussions with sociologists, former police officers, and civil rights advocates. The focus was no longer on Mr. Reuben Moore. Now his name served only as a doorway, and once that doorway was opened, long-suppressed memories, buried injustices, and an entire generation of people, once labeled as too sensitive, too emotional, or not credible enough, began to step into the light. The hashtag Eyes Like His began to trend, drawn from Clarence's own words. Thousands of people posted photos with captions that read, "I had those eyes once. I was once seen as less than human." And this time the media didn't lead. They followed, trailing behind a wave of truth they could no longer contain. Reuben Moore's story, once seen as an isolated case of abuse of power, had now become the shared testimony of an entire generation, a generation that had been labeled, dismissed, and forced to lower their gaze just to survive. But now they were raising their heads, not to seek revenge, but to reclaim the most basic of rights, the right to be looked at without being seen as a threat. And behind every gaze, behind every shared story, there echoed a quiet but undeniable shift, the kind that doesn't begin with revolution, but with recognition, not of a name, but of a truth too long ignored. On March 14th, the State Department of Justice issued a press release just 2 pages long, but it was enough to shake the foundation of South Bend's law enforcement system. Peter Vance was officially indicted on 3 primary charges: abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and willful endangerment of an unarmed citizen. This announcement did not come from a sudden moral awakening within the system. It was the result of a chain of undeniable pressure. The testimony of Ethan, the homeless witness Clarence Boyd, the resurfaced audio recording, the buried internal files, and, above all, a public demand for justice that had grown beyond the story of one man. Special investigators also confirmed that this was not the first time Vance had been the subject of complaints involving similar behavioral patterns, targeting people of color, overreacting, falsifying suspicious behavior claims, and then using his authority to erase records or manipulate reports. The formal indictment was not merely directed at Vance as an individual, but served as a statement that the legal system, however delayed, must finally reckon with its own shadow. In his first media response through legal counsel, Vance still pleaded not guilty, but this time he was no longer allowed to evade public scrutiny. The court mandated a public trial, with media access and the full case file available for disclosure. News of the trial spread quickly. Local stations built temporary studios near the courthouse. National networks created dedicated segments titled Tracking the Vance Case. Yet, amid all the frenzy, one name kept surfacing across news reports and commentary programs: Reuben Elias Moore. Everyone assumed he would testify. He was the central figure, the man who had a gun pointed at him, the one who had been dismissed by the system and was now witnessing a moment of judicial reckoning. But he did not appear. His absence, rather than silence, became the loudest presence in the courtroom. No press statement, no official reason given, just an empty chair at the witness stand, one that somehow carried more weight than any testimony could. And outside the courthouse, among the reporters and demonstrators, no one asked where Reuben Moore had gone, because they all knew he had already said everything that needed to be heard. And this time, the system would have to speak for itself. Instead, he submitted a handwritten statement to the court, 4 pages long, written in black ink, the handwriting clear, unadorned, and free of anger, just the truth, laid out like a summary for those who had once pretended not to see. The statement began with a line: "I am not here to reclaim dignity, because if dignity needs to be reclaimed through a verdict, then it never truly existed." He described in detail the moment the gun was pointed at him. Not to accuse, but to convey the feeling of having one's dignity stripped from the body, not because of any action, but because of prejudice. He recalled the eyes in the diner, the one holding a phone, the one looking down. No one fired a shot, but no one spoke either. He called it silent violence, the most contagious and hardest to cure kind in a society that had long learned how to close its eyes to injustice. He also did not forget to mention Vance, but not in curses. "I do not wish for him to be imprisoned. I wish that, just once, he would have to live a day where his mere presence is questioned, solely because of his skin and his silence. If the law cannot teach that, then I hope at the very least you still know what is wrong." The statement was read aloud in full at court, without edits. When the court officer read the final sentence, the courtroom fell silent. Vance bowed his head, though no one could say whether it was out of shame, exhaustion, or the fact that for the first time in his life he was being forced to listen without the power to make someone else stop. The trial would go on. Other witnesses would testify, the attorneys would argue, but the focus was no longer on Reuben. He did not need a stage. He did not seek victory. He only needed this society to understand he had once been cast out of justice not because of guilt, but because of the arrogance of those who were told they were always right. And now that arrogance was sitting in the defendant's chair, facing justice for the first time, not because he spoke, but because an entire generation after him refused to let him remain silent once again. As the trial of Peter Vance entered its second week, the ripple effects began to reach a place few expected, inside the South Bend Police Department itself. At the central headquarters, once an unshakable fortress of departmental unity, the air had grown heavy, as if no amount of fresh paint on the walls could conceal the cracks now forming. A collective letter, signed by 7 young officers, was posted publicly on the city's website. It did not go through the communications office. It was not screened or edited. It was simply an apology, direct, with no excuses, no deflections onto occupational stress or individual misconduct. We cannot undo what has happened, but we can begin by admitting this. We were trained to distrust those who look different from us. We learned to follow orders even when our conscience pushed back, and we were wrong. The letter did not call for anyone's resignation. It did not target any individual, but its tone, honest and brave, led to it being shared thousands of times overnight. The media dubbed it a rare moment of the police looking into their mirror. Soon after, 3 veteran officers who had worked alongside Vance submitted early retirement requests, foregoing their next scheduled pay review. In their letters, they gave no detailed explanations, only a single line: "I no longer feel proud to wear this uniform, and I do not wish to wear it one day longer if I cannot restore what it used to mean." No press conference was held, no one celebrated, but for many residents of South Bend, this fracture was not a sign of collapse, but the beginning of rebirth. A force cannot heal if it does not dare to admit its wounds come from within. Amid the constant stream of news about the trial, peaceful protests, and shifts within the police system, a special letter was delivered to the old wooden house of Reuben Elias Moore on the outskirts. The postmark was from Geneva. A blue seal marked the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The letter was brief but solemn. "We have followed the hearing and your statements with deep respect. As an international human rights body, we respectfully invite you to serve as an honorary advisor on ethics and human rights in a special research group focused on discrimination within public institutions." The Geneva office later confirmed to the press that this is the first invitation extended to a non-incumbent citizen, unaffiliated with any government organization, yet recognized globally for moral consistency. When news outlets reached out for confirmation of his response, Reuben sent only a single handwritten line, neither flowery nor evasive, but unmistakably clear. "I am grateful, but I do not need to stand at the United Nations to see truth honored. I need to stand where they once diminished me, to lift it with my presence." No fanfare followed, no trumpets, no formal ceremony. He simply continued to live where he was once nearly broken, not to dwell on the pain, but to prove it no longer had the power to define who is who. When Sophia heard of his refusal, she smiled quietly. "He's still the same," she said. "Never chooses the easy place to stand, only stands where someone needs to remain upright." And for many, that decision to refuse prestige, to preserve presence in a place once used to exclude him, was the greatest declaration Reuben Elias Moore had ever made. No microphone, no banners, just standing there, calm as a landmark that cannot be moved. A landmark that this time the system itself will have to walk around. On Monday morning, during a public meeting at the South Bend City Hall, the State Council officially passed a resolution to establish an independent commission on law enforcement and administrative accountability, following the receipt of over 100,000 signatures from citizens, along with a joint proposal by 7 state legislators from both parties. Unlike previous internal investigations, criticized for being merely procedural, this time the commission comprised 11 members, including 3 civilian representatives, 2 legal scholars, 2 retired officers with no pending investigations, 3 human rights attorneys, and 1 delegate appointed by the National Judicial Council. The main responsibilities to review all disciplinary records, complaints, and misfiled internal documents over the past 10 years at the South Bend Police Department, to investigate signs of cover-ups, document tampering, or the use of internal hold procedures to avoid disciplinary action against officers previously accused, and to propose a specific reform framework, including the full transparency of the internal reporting system and an external oversight mechanism. News about the commission spread rapidly as a wave of public expectation. On social media, many shared the phrase, "This is not just prosecution, this is rechecking the roots," because the public understood if things stopped at Vance's trial, the system would simply learn to sacrifice one man to keep everything else intact. A representative of Watch and Word gave a short statement at the announcement ceremony. "They used to call us extremists. Now they're calling us into the office. that is the first sign of change. While the resolutions were still being voted on, a handwritten letter unexpectedly appeared on the front page of the South Bend Morning News, the city's oldest local newspaper. There was no sensational headline, no portrait photo, just a simple square frame with a short introduction. A letter to the public from Police Chief Arthur Greaves. Arthur Greaves had led the department for 17 years. Once honored for maintaining order in crisis, he was seen as a role model by many generations of officers, but in the letter, which was barely 3 paragraphs long, he did not defend himself. I saw, I knew, but I did nothing. The first 3 lines of the letter read like a confession. No excuses, no context. He admitted he had read reports about Vance, had been warned about the hardline training culture, and had felt uneasy when complaints were closed too quickly. But he chose silence to maintain internal stability, avoid public backlash, and preserve departmental tradition. He ended the letter with a line that was both choked with regret and brutally honest. I was not forced to resign. I resigned because I am no longer fit to sit at the desk where I once turned my back on justice. The letter did not stir chaos. No one took to the streets to celebrate. But on community forums, one person wrote, "Silence was once part of the darkness. Today, at least one of them turned the light on." Arthur Greaves left his office at dawn. No press conference, no motorcade, just a nameplate quietly taken down. And for many, it was the first time the system truly understood the weight of 2 words: take responsibility. During the 3rd hearing of the Independent Investigation Commission, as members combed through case files from the 1990s, one faded name resurfaced from the deepest layer of the archives: Senior Detective Thomas Langley, the direct coordinator of the South Bend case in 1997, the case that had left Reuben Moore standing alone in opposition, ultimately forcing him to quietly step away from the federal legal system. Thomas Langley had retired in 2010 and was now living in a small riverside town nearly 300 miles from South Bend. But the silence of time could not erase the fingerprints he had left behind in the case files, the fingerprints of a man who manipulated the system in ways few dared to imagine, not through shouting, but by suffocating what deserved to be seen. The investigation revealed that in the 1997 case, the only testimony that could have exonerated the young black teenager was a taped phone call from an anonymous female witness, one who reported seeing a white man walking away from the scene. The recording had been logged in the initial report, but it never appeared in the documents submitted to the Federal Legal Advisory Panel that included Reuben Moore. No one knew why, until Sophia and the Watch and Word team found a handwritten internal memo, unencrypted, wedged between 2 old folders. It read, "Tape 1510, remove from main file, no need to submit." Below the note was a scrawled signature, TL, when contacted by the Commission for verification. Langley initially denied it, stating he couldn't recall what was handled 3 decades ago. But just 2 days later, the state prosecutor's office issued an official indictment against him for falsifying criminal investigation records, destroying legally admissible evidence, and causing significant harm, resulting in an unreviewed wrongful conviction. The press release consisted of just 2 paragraphs, but it was enough to make clear. The South Bend case of 1997 did not just forget one person, it sidelined an entire generation of justice for the sake of one signature. Upon hearing the news, Reuben did not speak publicly, but according to a close friend, he said only one sentence: "At last, a recording that was never heard has been given a name." Thomas Langley, when leaving his home under the protection of federal authorities, said nothing. His face was aged, stripped of the authority it once carried. But what silenced people was not his age. It was the truth that it was someone like him, with just enough rank to escape scrutiny and just enough power to alter a single detail, who changed the fate of a teenager, a legal advisor, and an entire city for nearly 3 decades. On forums, new hashtags began to surface: "Not Forgotten Tape" and "Justice for the Unnamed Boy," because this time no one believed phrases like "it was misplaced," "no one clearly remembers," or "that's too far in the past." This time, The truth had been preserved long enough that it could no longer be quietly burned away with the lifespan of those who once believed they'd get away. And on a crisp April morning, in the front courtyard of the South Bend Police Department, a building once seen as a symbol of power and silence, a press conference was held under gentle sunlight, without elaborate staging or excessive flags. Behind the podium stood a simple white board with 4 plain words: a first step. There, in the presence of the media, civilian oversight council members, and citizens who had signed the petition for internal review, Ethan Rivers was officially reinstated and appointed as the public spokesperson for the South Bend Police Department. The appointment was not the result of a media campaign or public pressure. It was decided after the investigative commission confirmed that Ethan had been the first to speak out from within the system, the one who voluntarily submitted the misconduct report, and, most importantly, the one who did not look away when something was wrong, even though he was just a rookie with less than 2 years on the force. When invited to speak, Ethan wore his uniform properly, though his initial nervousness was visible. He bowed his head, looked straight into the camera, and spoke with a voice neither trembling nor theatrical. "I don't represent the perfection of this department. I'm not a role model. I once stayed silent when I should have spoken, but I'm standing here today because I believe the right choice can start with one person and spread." He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words to express what so many had been waiting to hear. "I'm not here to cleanse the failures of law enforcement. I'm just here to remind us all. This system taught us how to follow orders, but this same system can learn to stop, to listen, and to change. If enough people remind it that power does not mean exemption from accountability." There was no roaring applause, no confetti, but many lowered their heads, not out of shame, but because for the first time in years they heard someone in uniform say what they had long hoped for, that change doesn't have to begin with a hero. It can begin with someone who simply chooses not to take the wrong step again. A young girl standing at the front of the crowd turned to her mother and asked, "Mom, is he the one who protected Mr. Moore?" The mother didn't answer. She just squeezed her daughter's hand and smiled. And on social media, the image of Ethan standing behind a plain wooden podium began to spread with a caption that resonated: "Not perfect, but chose right." For South Bend, this wasn't the ending, but perhaps it was the opening chapter of a new page, where those once taught to stay silent were beginning to learn how to say the right thing again. In the weeks following the trial and the wave of independent investigations that were triggered, no place in South Bend felt the tide of change more acutely than the Central Police Department, the former stronghold of internal discipline and firm tactical conduct. Now the atmosphere there felt like a balloon stretched to its breaking point. The department was split into 2 clear factions. One side was made up of mostly younger and mid-level officers, those moved by Ethan's testimony, the voice of the community, and the pressure of public scrutiny. They demanded sweeping reforms, from arrest procedures and use of force protocols to how internal complaints were recorded and addressed. To them, change was an opportunity to regain trust, both from the public and from within themselves. The opposing faction consisted of more conservative members, many of whom had held key positions under Carson, the former commander who retired after the incident, once known as the protector of officers with violent records who knew how to stick to the paperwork. To them, calls for reform were signs of weakness. They wanted to preserve command-control conduct, and even labeled Ethan as someone who had betrayed the force. One officer who had worked under Vance spoke anonymously to the press. "We've got no shield left. Carson's gone. Vance is being prosecuted. People like us are being treated like cancer. But no one's ever asked, why did the system train us this way in the first place?" Internal meetings grew cold, morning briefings tense. A quiet fracture ran like an invisible line through the uniforms, between those who wanted to preserve power and those ready to relearn how to earn respect through service. No press statements, no op-eds, no appearances on panels. But just as the South Bend police force reached its most chaotic internal moment, Reuben Elias Moore quietly submitted a petition to the state governor's office. The petition was fewer than 500 words long. It cited no sources, quoted no case law, and bore no rhetorical flourishes. Yet it contained 3 concise proposals powerful enough to send shockwaves through the entire law enforcement system. The 3 proposals were as follows. 1. Absolute prohibition of any physical approach toward a civilian who poses no clear threat, even if they do not respond to questioning immediately. Lack of response does not mean resistance. A slow reaction does not mean danger. 2. Mandatory continuous video recording of all stop and ID procedures, from beginning to end, without interruption. Any unexplained data loss or camera stoppage shall be treated as evidence tampering. Trust is not built with promises, it's built with light. 3. Any use of force will no longer be justified under the phrase, by procedure, if the civilian is unarmed. In such cases, default accountability shall lie with the officer who initiated the force. The law cannot side with the stronger party just because they were the first to file a report. The signature at the bottom of the page was a clean, brief line of ink. Reuben E. Moore. The petition was delivered through official postal channels to the governor's office, accompanied by a handwritten note. I do not ask for acceptance, I only ask that it be read. The news leaked 2 days later, and instantly it became the focal point of law enforcement symposiums, officer forums, and even state legislative caucuses. Supporters hailed it as the first draft of the future of policing. Detractors bluntly declared, if we implement this, we won't be able to do our jobs anymore. But whether loved or hated, no one could deny, for the first time in decades, a victim of abuse of power had become the one reshaping how the system must treat its citizens. And this time, he didn't need to be invited to speak. He didn't need to stand in any place of honor. He simply sat at an old wooden desk, wrote 3 proposals by hand, and made the entire system bow down to read them. One Thursday afternoon, just after a light rain cleared, the law hall at Midlands University remained as quiet as ever. Reuben Moore's name wasn't listed on any lecture schedule, yet when the students of the criminal law philosophy class entered, they saw an elderly man already seated at the wooden podium, holding a stack of old papers, his gaze gentle but deep. A young professor stepped forward, about to point out a scheduling error, but he simply nodded and said, I'm sorry, I just need a few minutes, if you'll allow me. And so, no one left the room. Reuben did not mention the restaurant incident, the trial, the medal badge, or the waves of controversy his name had stirred. He simply spoke in a voice slow, steady, and warm, like the soft crackle of dry wood in a fireplace. I used to believe justice lived in silence, that if one acted right, lived right, justice would recognize and protect them. But then I met a man. He stayed silent while the entire system was wrong, thinking, what can one person change? He resigned, didn't argue, didn't resist, just left. It wasn't until he had a gun pointed at him for sitting quietly where no one thought he had the right to be that he understood. Silence is never neutral. From that day, he started writing, speaking, sending letters, and every time he felt like stepping back, he remembered the eyes of those who once believed he'd be the one to speak for them. The room fell silent. The air thickened, not with heaviness, but with the quiet weight of truth that needed no lecturing. A student asked, that man, does he regret it? Staying silent for so long? Reuben smiled softly, then replied, yes, but he doesn't regret having once been silent. He only regrets that no one told him sooner. Standing still is still standing for something. He left before the dismissal bell rang. No signature, no commemorative photo, but in the notebook of a first-year student sitting in the front row, the line was written down and carefully underlined. Silence is a choice, but it also has consequences. 2 days after that nameless lecture, the office of the state governor held an emergency press conference. The spokesperson stepped out with a stack of documents and announced, the governor has signed into law the executive reform package proposed by citizen Reuben Moore. All 3 proposals from the petition were passed without revision. The local police department was given 6 months to standardize the new procedures. under the supervision of an independent judicial council. But the most surprising detail wasn't in the content. It was in a short handwritten note by the governor herself, at the bottom of the signed document, next to her signature. Sometimes, standing still is a form of action. I learned that from him. Only afterward did journalists dig into the archives. The current governor, Leona Carr, had been a senior in the public ethics and philosophy course at Midlands University in 1990. The professor at the time, Reuben Elias Moore, a former classmate, recalled, "He was the only one who didn't grade by scores. He graded with a single question. What have you changed after taking this class?" When asked why she didn't call or meet with Reuben before signing the law, Governor Leone simply replied, "Because he never needed to know who he had taught. He just needed to believe that what he once stood firm for was not left behind in silence." And so, the seed Reuben thought had quietly died turned out to have only been lying dormant somewhere, waiting for the day a former student would water it with a single signature. 3 weeks after Governor Leona Carr officially signed the petition for arrest procedure reform, South Bend entered a state never before seen in the history of its public sector, no longer marked by fierce resistance, but still not trusting enough to call it a rebirth. Instead, there was a long pause, where everyone waited to see who would be the first to turn policy change into real change in people's lives. That person, as many had predicted, was Sophia Ramirez. On a Saturday morning, without a press conference or invitations, Sophia appeared on the steps of an old red brick building, once a public library that had been closed for nearly 6 years due to a lack of funding. On the dark wooden door was a small brass plaque, simply engraved, "Morehouse," a place where everyone is heard without having to earn the right to speak. She opened the door and welcomed the first people inside. No one asked, "Why name it More?" Because the answer lived in the atmosphere itself. Not performative, not grand, just steady, attentive presence at the right time. In a small gathering with colleagues and individuals who had experienced police violence, Sophia said, "I didn't create Morehouse to honor anyone. He once said, 'Don't build a statue of me, build a space where others can stand still without being shot.' So this is not a memorial. It's a reminder. Presence must be sustained like a habit, not celebrated like an event. Morehouse is not a model legal center. There is no towering reception desk, no long table for closed-door meetings. Instead, there are small rooms with warm yellow lighting, a legal resource library organized by real-life scenarios, and a testimony room where people can share their experiences without having to file a complaint, without labeling it a serious incident, and without being measured by media noise. From individuals who were searched without cause to families whose young children were interrogated unjustly at school, every voice holds equal legal weight at Morehouse. No one gets priority. But no one is left behind either. Ethan was among the first to send congratulations. In a brief email he wrote, "Thank you for creating a place where someone like me, who once stayed silent, is still allowed to listen, so I can relearn how to stand on the side of what's right." Sophia did not reply, but on the wall near the library she hung a small wooden plaque. No name, no title, just engraved with the words, "I once thought I had to speak up for him. Later I realized I was speaking up for those who had once believed they weren't worth protecting." Morehouse was never intended to become a model. Sophia had made that clear. If we do things right, then 10 years from now, no one will need this place anymore, and that will be the real success. Even so, within just 2 weeks of opening, the center had already received more than 50 cases. Among them were 14 individuals who had never dared to speak about their experiences of being threatened by those tasked with protecting them. One man, a widower, who had once been arrested simply for matching a description, said during his first public session, "I used to think that if no one knew what happened to me, it would just go away. But today I realize it didn't go away, it just turned into silence." And when a freshman student asked Sophia whether Morehouse planned to open additional branches, she smiled and shook her head. "I don't want to open more places to retell pain. I want to close the reasons people have to walk into this one." Morehouse was never meant to be the summit of a movement. It was an ordinary place. But precisely because it was ordinary, it became the most essential kind of reminder. Justice is not something that should only be named in court. It must sit beside people every day without needing a reason. As Morehouse settled into steady operation, becoming a small but resolute space for justice at the heart of the city, many began to ask, could the change that started outside the system truly make its way inward? Could a police department, steeped in years of resistance and caution, learn to listen? The answer, once again, came from Ethan Rivers. After being reinstated and appointed as the official spokesperson for the South Bend Police Department, Ethan did not choose to sit behind a press conference table. He did not favor long interviews. He understood trust cannot be rebuilt through speeches or media sound bites. It can only be stitched back, thread by thread, through conversations that seem almost too small to manage. So, he initiated the Civil Response Task Force, a group of volunteer officers from various ranks, tasked not with patrolling, but with listening, taking notes, and responding to public concerns as a service, not defensively, not aggressively. The group made regular appearances at neighborhood community centers, schools, and most importantly, the city's Central Park. From that task force, a new initiative emerged, simple but powerfully symbolic: morning listening. The idea began when Ethan passed through the park and remembered this was where Mr. Rubin had once had a gun pointed at him. It was also where Clarence, the almost forgotten, unhoused witness, had seen injustice with his own eyes and not been believed. Ethan thought, if wrongdoing began in the park, then healing should begin there too. With support from the city council and community representatives, morning listening launched every Friday morning. There, a police officer without a bulletproof vest, without a weapon, sat at a plain wooden table in Central Park with a sign that read, "We are not here to investigate, we are here to understand." Residents could come and say anything, share a time they were treated unfairly, express their fear, or simply ask, "Why did you do that day?" Ethan took the first shift. He didn't speak much, just nodded, took notes, and responded when asked. An elderly woman who had lost her son in a wrongful arrest 10 years ago came and said, "I don't hate you. I just hate how everyone acted like it never happened." Ethan remained silent. Then he replied softly, "I used to act like that. Now I'm learning a different way." In the weeks that followed, many young officers signed up to participate. It wasn't mandatory, there was no roll call, but every Friday morning that wooden table was never empty, and every citizen who came and sat down left with the feeling that at least someone had listened, without interrupting, without suspicion, without a gun pointed at them. Morning listening didn't erase history, but it kept indifference from repeating. Just as Morehouse couldn't erase all pain, but gave people a reason to speak rather than bury it. And when asked why he chose the park as the place to begin, Ethan simply said, "Because if we're not brave enough to sit in the very place where the mistake happened, then every reform is just a promise hanging in midair." It wasn't a way to become a hero. It was simply a way to stop making the same mistakes in silence. The book, In the Moment No One Knew Who He Was, wasn't written to recount a single incident, but to tell of all that had been swallowed by collective silence. After the morning listening sessions continued regularly in the park, and after each word was received without judgment, something no one expected began to happen. People who had once been background figures in the story of Reuben Moore began to tell their parts of the memory. The first was Maria Lopez, the young waitress that day at the diner. Throughout the entire time the story exploded, she remained silent. She didn't participate in interviews. She didn't appear on social media. But one Sunday morning she came to Morehouse and left an envelope. inside of which was a handwritten letter. I didn't do anything wrong that day, but I didn't do anything right either. I saw Mr. Moore, saw the gun, saw the fear, and then I stepped back as if I wasn't there. I used to think the farther back I stood, the safer I'd be. Now I understand. Even silence leaves fingerprint. That letter was the first piece of a quietly forming idea in Sophia's mind, to create a collective book, not to recount the incident like a news report, but to gather fragments of memory swallowed by the feeling of, I'm not important enough to tell. Sophia titled the book, In the Moment No One Knew Who He Was, borrowing the exact line that once appeared in millions of headlines, they had no idea who he was. One by one, people came forward. Mrs. Agnes, the elderly white-haired woman who weakly said he eats lunch here every Thursday, while Vance pointed his gun, wrote, I used to think I had spoken up, but when I got home I realized that sentence was to ease my conscience, not to protect him. I said it to feel better about myself, not to stop the injustice. Then came Clarence, the homeless man once dismissed as mentally unstable, now writing with trembling hands on notebook paper. I don't have an address for mail to reach me, but if the book gets printed, please leave a copy on the park bench so folks who think they're invisible know this. No one stays invisible forever. A former student of Reuben, now a university lecturer, contributed an anonymous passage. When he was pushed out of the system, I didn't ask questions. I was worried about my scholarship. Now, I understand. Justice doesn't come from the smartest person. It comes from the one who stays standing the longest. The book spanned over 200 pages. It had no formal chapters, no chronological narration. Each page was a voice, a perspective, a way of remembering, and all of them shared one thing. Silence had once been a shelter, but now they chose to step out, not to undo the past, but to live differently. Ethan wrote a short foreword. I used to think Reuben Moore was the story of a man who had a gun pointed at him. Now I know. He's a mirror for everyone who's ever turned away when they should have stayed. When the book was released, there was no signing event. No one gave a speech. But in the park where it all began, a copy was placed on the third bench, the one Mr. Moore once sat on. Taped above it, a sheet of paper with black ink read, If one person can make us silent, another can help us speak. This is the speaking. The book didn't erase anyone's guilt, but it left behind the one thing that mattered most. We were once silent, but no one can make us stay silent. After the book, In the Moment No One Knew Who He Was released, small bookstores across the state ordered hundreds of additional copies, not because of the fame of its authors, who were all unnamed, but because the book made people pause amid the overwhelming flood of headlines to remember that witnessing is an act of ethics, and silence is never neutral. One special copy was sent to the library of Arlington High School, a public school in the suburbs where most students are Black or Latino. The principal, who had closely followed the Reuben Moore case, dedicated a special class period to reading excerpts to her 12th grade students. She ended the session by posing a question. If you had the chance to write to someone who had gone through this, what would you say? A student named Jalen Rivers, 17 years old, dark-skinned, round-eyed, and always seeming to shrink his shoulders to avoid attention, sat through the entire session without saying a word. But the next day, he quietly left behind an unsealed envelope for his homeroom teacher. Inside was a handwritten letter, the handwriting still shaky, with some words erased and rewritten, but every line carried deep meaning. My name is Jalen. I'm not good at talking in front of people, but when I heard about Mr. Moore, I thought, why was he never taught in our history class? Why didn't any of us know? I used to think the people who sat on the Supreme Court never looked like me. They're white. They go to big schools. They don't get called suspicious just for wearing a gray hoodie like I do. But then I read that he was there, that he once stood against a wrong verdict, and that he left, not because he lost, but because he wasn't allowed to win. I don't know if he'll ever read this letter, but if he does, please let him know this. I never thought someone like me had ever sat near the Supreme Court, and now I will never forget. The letter was carefully sent by the teacher to Moore House with a request for Sophia to deliver it by hand. When he received it, Reuben said nothing. He didn't reply. He didn't write back. But he folded the letter into fourths and carefully tucked it into his wallet, right next to the old worn federal badge, the one that had once symbolized power, but had also once been the reason a gun was pointed at him when people didn't know who he was. From that day on, anyone who met him at Morehouse would occasionally see him quietly take out his wallet, open the small compartment, look for a few seconds, and then put it away, as if reminding himself of a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Sophia once asked, half-jokingly, "Is there something special in that letter?" He simply smiled, placed a hand over his chest right where the wallet was kept close to his heart, and replied, "Because it's not just a letter. It's a future beginning to rewrite itself, without asking for permission." Jalen never knew that he had received it, but the boy began researching the field of law, applied to a college prep program, and wrote in his admission essay a simple line, "I don't want to be the first to do something. I just want to make sure I'm not the last one brave enough to try again." As for Reuben, each morning he sat by the window of his old wooden house, sometimes opening his wallet to look at the letter, as if it were the very thing that reminded him that a legacy doesn't live in what's built from stone, but in what makes a child believe that their place is here. Early morning. South Bend Park was quiet, as if no siren had ever echoed through the trees. The wind swept through the oaks, carrying the scent of damp leaves and coffee from the small shop across the street. The third bench from the main gate, the very spot where a gun was once aimed at an unarmed man, now had someone sitting there again. In his hands was an old leather-bound book, its spine worn, and the pages tinged with the color of tea. "Let me know when you're ready for the next part. Reuben Elias Moore." No more cameras, no more witnesses, and no one is looking at him like an unidentified suspect. Mornings like this, simple, unnoticed, were what he had longed for most of his life. Not because he wanted to be forgotten, but because he wanted the presence of someone like him to no longer be an event, but rather a given. He turned to a new page, his eyes quietly following each line. Resting on his lap was an old wallet, slightly bulging where it held the badge and Jalen's handwritten letter. He didn't carry anything else. He didn't need protection. He didn't need an escort. He didn't need anyone to know who he was. And then, amid the soft rustling of dry leaves and the morning calls of birds, a small hand touched the edge of the book he was holding. Reuben looked up. A boy, around 8 or 9 years old, with slightly curly hair and sun-kissed cheeks, stood in front of him. There was no fear in his eyes, nor the usual curiosity of a child, just sincerity, simple and clear, from someone ready to ask when he wanted to understand. The boy looked at him, then at the book, and asked in a small but steady voice, "Sir, what is justice?" The question fell like a pebble on still water, gentle, but it rippled through everything. Reuben didn't answer right away. He closed the book and set it aside, looked at the boy. He didn't ask his name, didn't ask why. He simply looked at him as though it was a very important question, not because it was big, but because the one asking deserved a thoughtful answer. He smiled softly, then replied slowly, "Justice is not about winning or losing. It's not about who's right or wrong. Justice is when you don't have to prove you're innocent just because of your skin color, the clothes you wear, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time." The boy blinked, tilting his head slightly. Reuben continued, his voice no louder, but each word landing as if it had weight. "Justice is when you can walk up to any adult, just like you're doing with me, and know they won't yell, won't doubt you, but will listen." The boy nodded slowly, then suddenly asked, "So, is there justice yet, sir?" Reuben didn't lie, and he didn't soften the truth. "Not enough, son. But if you're still asking that question, then there's still room for it to exist." The boy smiled, then ran off, joining a group of friends playing near the grassy field. Reuben watched him go, his hand still resting on the book. His eyes didn't water, but something in his gaze loosened, like a scar long held beneath the skin had finally been given air. That day, He didn't write down the conversation, didn't share it with anyone, but in his wallet, beside the old letter and the badge, once mistaken for a suspicious object, he quietly scribbled a single line, tucking it behind Jalen's note. Justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with a child willing to ask and an adult willing to stay and answer. The ripples spreading from South Bend, from Morehouse, from morning listening, from the collective book when no one knew who he was, were no longer isolated movements. They had become a national current, because within each letter, each gathering, each handwritten line, from people once quietly shut out of the system, a truth was becoming undeniable. Justice isn't only threatened by wrongdoing, but by organized silence. And to dismantle that silence in an organized way, the National Commission on Police Conduct Reform was officially established in early June, after a wave of states across the country passed a joint resolution to overhaul law enforcement practices. This commission didn't only include legal experts, senators, or administrative advisors. For the first time in history, key roles were equally divided among three groups of representatives: civil community members, including those who had been victims of abuse of power, active duty officers from various ranks, and independent scholars and policymakers. The commission's headquarters were placed at a public university in Washington, D.C. As a symbol, justice would be rebuilt not from a secure government building, but from the place where people learn how to ask questions. Questions like the one asked by the boy in the park the other day, simple, direct, but powerful enough to make an entire society listen to itself again. The commission's launch ceremony was held in the Central Auditorium, a venue that had hosted hundreds of policy forums, but never an opening event featuring a young officer. Once a silent witness like Ethan Rivers. He wore plain clothes, no name badge, no prepared speech. When he stepped to the podium, the entire room heard nothing at first but a deep breath, then a clear voice, not from a spokesperson, but from a man who had once stood beside silence and decided never to stand with it again. I once stood beside a man who had a gun pointed at him, not because he posed a threat, but simply because he didn't look like everyone else. I didn't intervene, I didn't shout, I just stood there, in my uniform, with a power I didn't fully understand and with a silence I now know was wrong. Now I stand here, not to justify, but to make a promise. No one else, whether they are a person of color, elderly, or simply sitting reading a book, should have to witness that again. The hall was silent, not from a lack of response, but because every word had been just enough. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't bow his head. He ended his speech with a sentence that carried no political weight. Only a simple line he once scribbled on a scrap of paper during a sleepless night at Morehouse. The system doesn't fail on its own. It fails when we don't fix it. And I, as part of it, choose to begin with myself. When he stepped down, no thunderous applause followed, but some people, including representatives of the black community and mothers who had lost children to police violence, nodded slowly, deeply, as if in that moment every fracture had found its first bond of healing, not through decrees, but through responsibility, spoken aloud by someone who once remained silent. That day no one said, "Justice has arrived," but everyone knew it had begun to enter, for the first time, through a door opened from both sides, from the people and from those who once held the key. In the early days of the National Reform Commission, as Ethan began traveling across states to establish unarmed civil gatherings, and Ruben continued his weekly visits to Morehouse, Sophia Ramirez quietly completed a personal project she had left unfinished for nearly 2 years, a book not meant to recount an event, but to decode how the system had carefully swallowed up morality through silence that was systemically maintained. The book, titled The Man Behind the Wall of Silence, wasn't written as a celebratory biography. On the contrary, Sophia placed herself in the position of someone betrayed by the very system she believed would uphold justice. She opened the book with a line that was cold, but not bitter. We didn't just lose a man named Reuben Moore. We lost the mirror that once reflected the dignity of the legal system when we chose to believe in appearances over truth. The book was divided into 3 parts. Part 1 recounted the process by which Reuben was isolated in 1997. Part 2 was an internal dialogue of a generation of students, like Sophia, who once stayed silent and carried the weight of a question they had never dared to ask. Part 3 detailed that fateful afternoon at the diner, where a gun was drawn solely because a black man was sitting and reading a book. It was Part 3 that many law schools from Yale and Georgetown to the University of Johannesburg excerpted and included in their curriculum on ethical response in law enforcement. A French scholar remarked, "Sophia did what many legal texts fail to do. She made readers tremble, not because of the facts, but because of the cruelty of familiarity." The book was soon translated into more than 10 languages. No loud promotion, no political tributes, but it appeared exactly where it was most needed, in classrooms, in local libraries, and in the desks of young students being taught to follow procedure instead of ask questions. When she sent Reuben a first copy, Sophia didn't write a dedication. She simply tucked in a small piece of paper that read, "No one truly lives behind the wall of silence, but someone once had the patience to stand there until others were ready to walk forward with him." On an early autumn morning, while Reuben sat on his porch reading Jalen's old letter, Sophia called, her voice filled with light. "Do you know what day it is today?" Reuben smiled softly. "Another Friday, huh?" Sophia replied, her voice still laced with unmistakable pride. "Today, Officer Amory DeWitt was officially sworn in at South Bend. He's the first black officer to receive a formal appointment in almost 60 years, and he studied law through the very civic education program you designed for middle schoolers 3 years ago." Reuben paused. He couldn't recall every bullet point he had written in that curriculum. He only remembered saying one thing to those kids: if you're going to be taught how to follow the law, then you deserve to know this: the law was made to serve you, not to rule over you. Amari had been one of those kids. Now fully grown, he wore the badge of law enforcement, but on his swearing-in day he carried no weapon per the condition he had proposed. Reuben didn't say anything. He simply opened his wallet, looked again at Jalen's letter, gently folded it, placed it beside the old badge, and looked out toward the distant park, the place where that boy had once asked him, "What is justice?" Today he no longer needed to answer, because a new generation, like Amari, was rising to its feet, and they were redefining that word through their very presence. After all the months of turmoil, the city of South Bend had returned to peace. But it was no longer a passive peace, born out of fear or avoidance, but a quiet with depth, where conversations had begun and old wounds were being acknowledged, not concealed. In a quiet corner of the South Bend Public Library, a place few paid attention to, an elderly man would appear every Monday afternoon. Reuben Elias Moore, now absent from the headlines, no longer spoke at panels, gave interviews. He simply carried with him an old canvas bag, filled with a few books and a stack of handwritten pages. He chose to sit near the legal section, rows of thick law texts, most of them collecting dust on their spines. Here, Reuben did what he believed mattered more than any public speech. He wrote fragments of memory, short reflections like gentle reminders, unsigned, undated, and quietly tucked them into the pages of old volumes. Some of the lines read, "Justice doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it's just one person willing to stand still when others are walking in the wrong direction. I once thought silence was how you stayed safe, but then I realized it's also where wrongness lives the longest. If you're reading this, maybe you're also searching for something. Don't think justice has to be grand. Sometimes it's just the act of not turning away." No one knew where the notes came from, but librarians began saving them, gently affixing them to the edges of pages as if they were part of the books themselves. Law students borrowing those books started passing the messages around, calling them "Notes from the One Who Stood Still." Reuben didn't know this, but he kept writing week by week, as if just one person stumbling onto the right page at the right time might give justice another chance to whisper. One summer morning, in the same park as always, The third bench from the entrance, once the flashpoint of everything, had now become a familiar resting spot for early walkers. A little girl, about 6 years old, her hair braided into 2 neat plaits, ran circles around the bench, while her mother, a black woman in her early 30s, sat reading a book. Suddenly, the girl bent down and picked up a small metal object, its corners worn, its surface slightly tarnished, but the engraving still clear. She turned it over curiously in her palm, then ran to her mother and held it up, asking, "Mommy, what's this justice mean?" The mother set her book down, looked at her daughter, then at the badge in her tiny hands. She knew immediately what it was. That old badge, once at the center of a storm, once a symbol of a question misunderstood and a life nearly ended for daring to sit still. But she didn't explain the past with painful words. She looked at her daughter and gently said, "Justice is when someone stands still, so people like you can move forward without having to bow your head." The girl blinked, nodded, not quite grasping it all, but sensing something deeper than words. She clutched the badge, not as a simple object, but as if holding a promise. The two continued walking, leaving the bench empty, but not meaningless. Across the park, where the library welcomed the early sun, an old man had begun another afternoon of quiet writing. He didn't know about the girl, didn't know where the badge had gone, but he kept writing, because some things don't need to be known to still live on. Because justice, sometimes, is simply someone willing to stand still long enough for others to learn how to walk in the right direction. Late summer afternoon. Sunlight slanted through low windows, casting a soft golden hue over the old shelves in the library. The paper notes that what Reuben once wrote had now been carefully framed and hung on a small wall behind the librarian's desk. No author was credited. The only label read, "From someone who stayed when everyone else walked away." Reuben no longer came to the library every week. The wooden house where he lived was quieter now, but not somber. The fragments of memory he continued to write still lay tucked neatly in his notebook, its first page blank of any name or title, bearing only one line. "I don't write to be remembered. I write to remind others." Someone once stopped. That afternoon he sat alone on the porch. The breeze was light, carrying nothing in particular. On the table sat a cup of tea, now cold, a notebook, still half empty, and a small metal object wiped clean but still catching the sunlight, a weathered badge bearing the seal of the Supreme Court. He picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand as he had done thousands of times before. No longer did it carry the weight of power, nor the burden of a title misunderstood. Now it was simply a keepsake of a time, a moment, and a question once left unanswered. Reuben lifted his gaze toward the park, no longer a place where guns were drawn, now a space where children laughed, without needing to bow their heads for existing. Then he spoke, perhaps to the wind, or to an old friend unseen who might have been sitting beside him. "I never hoped to be remembered as someone great, never wanted a statue or a program bearing my name." He smiled gently, like the breeze brushing past the eaves, and added, "I only hope that if someday someone mentions me, they say he didn't turn away. Not a hero, not a victim, just a man who stood still at the right moment, when others, out of fear, fatigue, or compromise, had chosen to walk on." As the evening sun stretched long shadows across the windowsill, he stood, walking slowly back into the house. The small room was just as always, no ornate decoration, no trace of a man who had once passed through history, only the wooden desk where he still sat to write. On the desk, the metal badge lay neatly beside the notebook that still held blank pages. There was no wrapping, no storage box. But the late afternoon light slipped through the window slats, falling across the table, and for a moment the surface of the badge caught the light again. Not shimmering like glory, but glowing like a quiet reminder. Someone once held it, not to protect himself, but so no one else would have to pay the price of silence. A breeze passed through, lifting the first page of the notebook ever so slightly. No words, no name. But it was no longer a space, it was a place, held open for those who would come next, if they were ready to write. Outside, the park filled again with the sound of children running and laughing. And somewhere in this city, justice did not come from decree, but from the way one man quietly refused to turn away and taught others how to stand together. Outro. No statue was ever built in his name. No speech ever listed him among heroes, but on every park bench, every old book reopened, and every time the question, "What is justice?" is asked, he is there, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. Standing still at the right moment can be the act that changes a generation. Reuben never needed to be remembered as the one who won, only as the one who did not turn away. And because of that, there are children now who grow up never needing to bow their heads when passing a shadow in uniform.